Chapter 1591 Life Seal. The claws sank into the young rhino's chest, drawing blood. But then it was like they had been frozen in place. The claws of the lion lineage youth bent back under the pressure, and then suddenly sparks and blood melded into the air. Boom! A fiery pillar of silver rose into the air, and a gene descended before the rhino lineage youth. It integrated into his body, and his rune armor spontaneously manifested as a result. It wasn't a perfect rune. Silas didn't have the time to force such a thing. It was instead a rune formed to vitality mastery. Even so, it was unlike anything the rhino lineage had ever seen in the history of the 073 Sanctum. The stats of these F tiers were so low to begin with. With the rhino gene and the warlord armor stacked atop one another, each one coming together for a tenfold increase. By comparison, the lion lineage youth hadn't even summoned his armor yet, choosing to focus on speed. It had to be remembered that not everyone was Silas, capable of drawing their rune armors in an instant. Even with an integrated gene, this ability didn't come naturally unless you had drawn your rune armor to 100% mastery. In this entire gathering, you could count the number of people who had done such a thing on a single hand, and only for the F grade. Out of the tens of millions that had come here to participate, there were only so few. This rhino lineage youth would certainly not be one of them. And neither would this lion lineage youth. Unfortunately for the latter, that caused him to suffer. The fusion of the rhino warlord gene had been used by Silas as a bridge for the spontaneous formation of the rune armor. While outsiders might think he was trying to help the youth draw the rune armor, Silas knew that this was impossible. He had once used Gwenu to test a theory of his. There was a natural understanding that came with being a spark master that seemed almost metaphysical. These days, when he comprehended things about rune mastery, it almost felt like the universe was whispering to him. He was used to comprehending things by piecing them together along a logical train of thought. But his rune mastery had long surpassed that. Whenever he did cobble something together based purely on logic alone, it usually came with an unfathomable breakthrough. So, back then, Silas had wondered if he could share some of this unique insight with someone else, guiding him subtly with a light normally only he could see, a spark only he could create. It had worked back then. Thanks to him, Gwenu had shown a sudden burst in comprehension and touched upon a new level. Of course, he hadn't needed her to with the E grade level of the Rune Master Challenge, but it had been a proof of concept. Thanks to that, he had been able to help Nosfaline grasp the whale lineage perfectly. Though that was a lot easier since she was his contract, so he could be even more hands-on. To Silas, this proof of concept was little more than aiding him in grasping secrets of spark mastery he hadn't understood before. He had no interest in going around helping people, until his hand was forced here. But with limited time and few options, he couldn't use this method the same way he had with Gwenu. This ability was incredibly limited. He couldn't just turn anyone into a rune master genius, they had to have a baseline of talent to begin with. Nosfaline had been a telekinetic expert with talent for rune mastery from the moment Silas met her. Gwenu spoke for herself as one of Grelith's cherished disciples. Despite the fact she had left the warlord path most suitable for her, turning her back on the serpent lineage to join the scorpion lineage, she had still accomplished so much. Compared to them, this youth was an utter waste of space. What could Silas possibly do with him? But then Silas thought of something. He couldn't use extricate on a living being. He had been through that with Nosfaline before. He also couldn't kill the youth because there was a good chance the overseers might just use that as an excuse to expel their whole sanctum and continue to cut corners to save time and nurture their personal laziness. But the system could apply a gene for him. Silas used ancient Ithkal to trigger comprehensions within the youth's will. Thanks to Reaper Sealright, he was able to clearly feel the rhino will as though it were right before him, and he acted as the bridge to the young man. But this was only just the beginning. As the youth's feel for the rhino will deepened, the space the system had made within his body to draw the rhino warlord gene when it was ready to be formed was opening up, growing stronger as it prepared to accept a stronger gene. That was precisely Silas' angle of attack. Through Reaper Sealright, he applied Life Seal not in an attempt to seal the young man away in a gene lock, but instead to force the gene to respond not to the young man's drawing of the rhino warlord armor, but to Silas' own drawing of it. The result. When the gene appeared before the young man, even through so many filters, it was the unique gene of a rhino armor drawn to vitality mastery. On top of that, the guiding light Silas had been using to help the youth process the complex runes bloomed. The instant the gene was no longer under the influence of life seal, it erupted, imposing what lingering will Silas had left behind into the outside world. The result? A rhino armor that spontaneously formed not at vitality mastery, but spark mastery. In a complete daze, standing there with a blank expression, the rhino lineage youths physical stats shot up by more than 100,000. The arm of the lion lineage youth exploded. Chapter 1592 Good luck. The agonizing scream shook the air of the battlefield. However, it was short-lived. The rhino armor completely formed and the youth raised his head to the skies, roaring to vent out the power shaking within his very bones. The youth didn't even try to kill the lion lineage youth, it just happened. The force of the shockwave and the power of a single stomp was all it took. There was nothing left of him. Victory 073 Sanctum. Countless eyes fell on Silas. It could be said that barely anyone had been paying attention to such an inconsequential battle. However, there was a glaring problem. The participant of the 073 Sanctum had taken the longest to arrive on stage. It was only a delay of a few seconds, but it was glaring. Whether by coincidence or not, many took note of this, but it was still something that could be overlooked. If not for the fact there was a glowing beam of light around the participant that should have been moving forward, a beam of light that was very clearly and somehow being obstructed by another F-tier of all things. This would have still been a matter that could be relatively easily ignored. If not for the fact the battle had ended so violently and so abruptly. The battles between the lower-tier sanctums shouldn't have had such large disparities. This was part of the reason many understood the actions of the overseer. Deciphering who was strongest and weakest amongst this rabble would have taken forever. The next rounds would already take weeks, maybe even months to play out. None of them had the time or patience to consider the feelings of the lower rabble. But when such a thing happened? What happened? The Emperor Dove asked with a frown. He hadn't been paying enough attention. All he saw was Silas holding onto the youth's shoulder, and then there was a sudden forceful power spike. That unique gene absorption process, which of them were unfamiliar with it? They knew it all too well. That was what happened when someone felt that they had reached the limits of their rune armor's potential and wanted to take the next step. But vitality mastery. Some F-tiers of the Iwoa sanctums might reach this stage, but what were the odds that one of them would be randomly selected? Just what happened? In the group of the 073 Sanctum, the warlords were standing in shock. Of everyone, they were paying the most attention. Their luck was horrible. Of their F-tiers, the rhinos were definitely the absolute weakest thanks to Silas. They had thought it was already all over until Silas suddenly appeared. What had he just done? They couldn't even begin to understand it. Priyan felt the whale warlord's gaze on him. He gave her a glance and then looked away, not saying a word. But for someone like Priyan, this was already as good as admitting defeat. There was no way this victory had to do with anyone other than Silas himself. Orthrian's pupils constricted into pinholes. He went from feeling that he would rather die than see Silas eliminated before his revenge, to feeling that there was a gap that existed between the two of them that he couldn't even fathom. A growl escaped his lips, his hooves driving into the ground and crushing the earth. A flash of gold appeared before the rhino lineage youth. Elbram seemed to have teleported there, but oddly enough, Silas couldn't feel the spatial fluctuations at all. The rhino youth was so lost in his roar that he didn't even notice a powerhouse beyond his comprehension was standing before him. Elbram didn't do anything to him, though, just watching with narrowed eyes. Then, his head slowly turned toward Silas. Silas had seen many things in the last year of his life, but this gaze was undoubtedly the most powerful he had been forced to personally face. The gap was so large compared to the next strongest things individual he had faced that he almost felt like a completely different sort of existence. Silas only blinked a single time, but Elbram was already in front of him. He didn't mean to blink, it was almost like his eyes had been dried out by the extension, a stinging pain pushing it over the edge. "Do you think you've overstepped your bounds?" Elbram asked a peculiar question. "No," Silas said calmly. At that moment, even those that had missed what happened were paying close attention now. Is that so?" Silas didn't reply. He felt like Elbram was looking at him for a completely different reason. He didn't care how these matters played out at all. Given Scylla's intelligence, it didn't take him more than a breath of time to understand. It was trivial once he sensed the aura Elbrum was radiating. Scorpion. Emperor Scorpion, to be specific. You didn't exactly allow this disciple of your sanctums to prove himself, now did you? Elbrum pressed. What did he do to earn the right to prove himself? Scylla asked a simple question in return. Elbrum grinned. It was a wild grin, one that carried the edge you would expect from a scorpion. The scorpion aura Scylla's was used to sensing in the warlord sanctum was neutered, weakened, layered with escapism. It didn't carry the same madness it should at all. But this one did. This was a man who could do anything, a man without the slightest hint of a bottom line. Indeed, what did he do to earn the right? But you certainly did earn it, now didn't you? Scylla didn't reply. You must think that you can carry your sanctum all on your own, Once again, Scylla didn't reply, but Elbrum's grin was only growing wider. All right, let me see it. You're a scorpion, aren't you? Be a scorpion. Scylla found himself phased out of reality as Elbrum waved a hand, he and the other 14 sanctums that passed through this elimination round appearing on a new battlefield. However, Scylla was alone, his face still pale and his will still depleted from his earlier actions. Across from him were the F-tiers of 14 sanctums. Any sanctum that kills you will be penned in at 071 at worst. If you win, though, I'll give your sanctum the same treatment as a top 30 sanctum for the duration of the F-tier competition. Good luck. Chapter 1593 Forfeit. Scylla took a deep breath, but it didn't seem to be enough. He looked down at his hand and somehow felt like it had tripled. 3 sets of thumbs and 12 fingers floated out in an odd frequency of space, passing through reality as though both real and not. He shook his head. The effort of deciphering the rhino armor wasn't the problem. It would hardly take him much effort. He just hadn't done it in the past because he had no interest. The real issue was slowing the activation of the formation. Fighting back against runes that much stronger than himself wasn't something he should have done. It was a miracle he was standing at all. Honestly, he couldn't recall the last time he had felt this weak. Maddened enlightenment was working in overdrive, his will trying to quickly recover, but he had surprisingly reached a state he hadn't even known was possible. He was too tired to even focus. Let alone the fact, maddened enlightenment was far weaker if he wasn't in a state of meditation. He didn't believe he could meditate right now even if he wanted to. His thoughts were slowing, and in a moment of hesitation, he wondered if he should just summon Nosfaline to deal with this. There was likely no individual existence who could threaten him here, but there were on the order of tens of millions here. On top of that, who knew what combination attacks they had practiced for this war? If they were smart and realized just how tired he was, what was stopping them from sacrificing a large number of themselves to coordinate something that could actually harm him? There were too many ways this could go wrong. Summoning Nosfaline was definitely the smartest choice if he was only considering this battle alone. But let alone this battle here, there were still 70 other F-tier sanctums, and the E-tiers of those very same sanctums he had yet to battle. Scylla closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the roaring auras. After a moment, he shook his head and took a seat, his head growing heavy. It was hard to put an exact number on the sheer number of people who were paying attention to Scylla right now. But there was something about his every action that just seemed unbothered. After he made a decision, there was really no need to waste time doubting himself. The number of times he had been wrong in his life were too few. Since there was no better option, why should he waste his time? So what if they knew about Nosfaline? What could they do about it? As Scylla was about to lose consciousness, a golden glow appeared behind him. He pushed himself just one more time, just enough to form a connection with his hibernation realm and summon her. At that moment, a beauty appeared with a wild flare. Nosfaline seemed to have returned to her roots. As a mesmerix, she could easily look however she pleased, and so, it was only natural she chose her Clipsian origins. Her skin had returned to a delicate blue hue, scales lining her cheeks and dotting her forehead. Her hair remained white, but it was done up in gorgeous braids, lined with seashells that radiated shimmering colors of white, silver, and gold. A skirt skin that looked formed of seal hide wrapped around her lower body, matching with a white band that contained her proud bust. Hovering to her back, 9 perfectly polished steel balls bobbed. As though there was no difference between herself and Scylla's, she seamlessly took control of the silver morphic bearings. To the F tiers of the bottom 30 sanctums, she was little different from a goddess, but her appearance was something that equally drew the attention of all those spectating, and Nosphaline's serpentous origins were almost entirely suppressed right now, so it was near impossible to tell that she was a beast at all. Master, Nosphaline said softly, pressing a hand to Scylla's back to make sure he didn't topple over. Her gaze didn't seem very focused on the so-called geniuses of their sanctums before her at all. The quantity didn't faze her in the slightest. In fact, until now, they showed no signs of attacking. There were undoubtedly quiet discussions going on, while some were just hoping that someone else would take the charge. However, slowly but surely, there was a hierarchy of command taking root, and the impossibly large group was quickly organizing themselves into a state where whatever attack they did launch would be undoubtedly lethal. Even so, Nosphaline didn't seem to notice. Her gaze was focused on Scylla's, and it was only after she realized that he was only extremely tired and not injured that she relaxed a bit. It was funny, she had definitely been paying attention to what was going on outside, but she had still wanted to make sure. After a while, she finally focused her gaze on the sea of enemies before her. She scanned the line one by one, her will wantonly checking their stats without the slightest care. She raised an eyebrow. Weak. The best of them had stats in the few thousands. Even if they summoned their armors, it wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference. Nosphaline didn't even need to move. She raised her hand, and the morphic spheres became spinning discs. These were the very first weapons she had used when she first met Scylla's. It had been a very long time since she had used them, but the training was ingrained into her very bones. She clenched a fist, and the discs suddenly grew as much as 5 meters across. And then they vanished in a veil of fog. The sea of enemies didn't even get a chance to finish their plans. While screams began to fill the air, it had little to do with those that had already been bisected at their hips. They were long dead. It was those cowering in despair in the back that realized their lives would also be forfeit. Chapter 1594 Brilliance. Nosphaline walked slowly out of the battlefield, Scylla's hovering in front of her on a slightly curved bed of silver. There wasn't the slightest hint of blood on her other than the blush on her cheeks that underlined the barest hint of fatigue. No matter what, tens of millions of enemies were still tens of millions of enemies. At a normal pace, even if you killed one every second, it would take hundreds of days to finish. Nosphaline had ended a battle like this in just 3 hours. That was how long it took before what hoped they had fully collapsed and they began to directly give up one after another. But the amount of death on her hands was unfathomable, and yet right this moment, she seemed as pristine as always. When she returned to the group of the 073 Sanctum, beams of light appeared around them as they ascended beyond the lower tiers to the same tier as those Sanctums ranked from 030 to 011. The gazes on them didn't fade. If anything, they only multiplied, but Nosphaline remained lost in her own world, finding a seat and then laying Scylla's head to rest on her lap. A light smile curled her lips as she stroked his hair. It was rare she got to see Scylla's expression so relaxed, and it felt even better that he was all but leaving his life in her hands right now. It was hard to say how long he would sleep, but she had every intention of doing her best in the meantime. "Welp, that didn't go how you expected, now did it?" Emperor Dove asked with a smile on his face. Elbram didn't say a word, but he also didn't go back on what he had said. He didn't expect for Scylla's to have such a powerful summon on him. It wasn't exactly rare for a rune master to have a powerful summon. In fact, it could be said that rune masters were the largest demographic of summoners to begin with. However, those of the Beast Sanctums weren't exactly the typical rune masters. As Grelith had said many times before, they were predominantly masters of will rather than rune masters. Even so, having a summon was one thing. Having such a powerful summon was a completely different matter. This Nosphaline, by the power she had displayed, she was at least a match for the experts in the 020 range of Sanctums, even without Scylla's being conscious. This was a shocking realization to anyone, let alone the 073 Sanctum who had seen Nosphaline before but had yet to see her in action. They must have thought that, given all the danger they had seen Scylla's in before, it would have made sense for him to use Nosphaline long ago if she was so powerful. But he never had. To the side, Ekir exhaled. He had no idea how long he had been holding his breath for, but he had really thought that things were over for a moment. Even after Silas managed to skirt by the first hurdle through unfathomable means, he had been worried that the Emperor Scorpion would give him trouble. It turned out that there was trouble to be dealt with, but somehow Silas had managed to deal with it once again. The 073 Sanctum might be weak, but they still had D tiers and powerful C tiers. Yet right this moment, it felt like Silas had become the center of them all. High above them, Roboreda frowned as she looked at Nosfaline. She could feel something faint, but she wasn't exactly sure what it was. Of course, she wasn't gawking at Nosfaline like all the men around her were, she was feeling something much deeper and sharper than that. But she couldn't quite put her finger on it. However, just as she was about to dig deeper, Nosfaline suddenly looked up at her. This startled Roboreda. They were separated by so many layers of runes, and Nosfaline had looked so focused on Silas' well-being, gently stroking his hair and making sure that he was comfortable. For her to suddenly look up at her like this, even though she shouldn't be able to see her in the first place. Had she really sensed something? How could she sense something from so far away? What's wrong, Roboreda? Jealous you're not the center of attention anymore? A young woman of the serpent lineage teased. Despite looking of smaller stature and lesser status than Roboreda, she was actually much older than Roboreda. But for whatever odd reason, she was still in the F tier. Roboreda smiled and poked at the F tier's head. She didn't try to deny it because there was no point. Something like this would never bother her. If anything, it was a good thing she had fewer people gawking at her. It was quite annoying. What do you think? The young woman asked. About. Have you ever seen a summon like that? I don't even think Beatrix's summons are that powerful. Roboreda's eyes narrowed. I'm not sure it's a summon. Despite the questioning look, Roboreda didn't explain. It was just a feeling, and she didn't have a strong hold on it. But what was especially odd to the Jade Race beauty was the fact that no one else seemed to notice. How was that possible? That was when she thought of a possibility, and her pupils constricted. There was only one reason this would happen. Right here, right now, she was the most sensitive to the Serpentist lineage by far. She might not be the strongest of the Serpent lineage here, but she was the only Emperor Serpent. Yet, even she could only barely sense Nosfaline's existence. It was so subtle that without this deduction, she wouldn't even be sure. For Nosfaline to be able to hide even from her B-tier seniors, but not from her. It meant that Silas wasn't a summoner, he was a Beast Master. A Beast Master with a Serpentist so powerful even an Emperor Serpent couldn't see through her completely. Roboreda's eyes flashed with brilliance. What could she learn by dissecting such a specimen? How much more powerful would her Serpent Emperor armor become? Chapter 1595 Won't Fall. The round continued. With Nosfaline's victory, the rest of the rankings for the F tier still needed to be decided, and that had no choice but to start with the bottom 30. According to Elbram's original plan, in order to streamline things and make it faster, only one team would be allowed to compete against the higher brackets. So, he planned to continue the randomized one-on-one battles. It was a good thing that Silas had been rewarded like he had been. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to repeat the same steps he had. At that point, he might just very well be forced to kill all the F tier of the 073 Sanctum. However, even that would be unlikely to work. There were hundreds of thousands of them. Silas couldn't possibly split his will in that many directions. He simply wouldn't have enough time to kill them all. It could even be said that Elbram's challenge had only helped him. But it also meant that a new seeded chosen had to be selected to continue to the next round. With the 073 Sanctum being treated like a top 30 Sanctum, they obviously wouldn't be the ones to continue into battle against the 041 to 070 Sanctums. Thus, a new one had to be selected. Interestingly enough, it was a familiar Sanctum that came out on top after these two rounds were concluded. The 064 Sanctum. Those of the 073 Sanctum were all too familiar with this Sanctum. Well, they were at least quite familiar with one lineage that came from them, the Bat lineage headed by Biomad. The Bat lineage had long left this Sanctum behind and were then expelled from the 073 Sanctum. But it seemed that their hold on the 064 Sanctum was much stronger than the 073 Sanctum had known. Not only did they return to the 064 Sanctum, but of the bottom 60 Sanctums, they managed to come out as number 1, effectively jumping more than 20 places for the F tier. While this raised some eyebrows, not many seemed to react to this as harshly as they should have. For one, this was still the ranks of the F tier, and no one cared very much. In addition, the bottom 60s were still considered to be of relatively low rank. There was a huge gap between every 10 leaps, but even so, by the time you got to the 041 sanctum, the F tier still didn't have 6-figure stats. In the eyes of the larger sanctums, they were still pitifully weak and not worth much of an extra look. The fact the 064 sanctum had shown real struggle to get to this point only made others care even less for their achievements. Because Elbrum had chosen such a lazy path, they had cut down the time needed significantly, not even taking 3 hours to settle on the bottom 60 ranks. But it was also because of that the odds of a much weaker sanctum graduating to a higher level were more possible. Had Silas been awake, he would have certainly taken note of this matter. But he was still in a deep sleep and showed no signs of waking up. Nosfaline couldn't help but frown seeing the way things were going. 3 hours should have been enough for Silas to wake up given his stats and his recovery abilities. If Silas had been in a state of high stress leading up to this moment, Nosfaline could understand it, but he hadn't been. He had been relaxing on Earth all this time. Except for, Nosfaline's pupils constricted. Could it be related to that? The suppression of the 073 Sanctum's Scorpion lineage seemed to have been something Silas shrugged off. But could it be that shrugging it off had taken more out of him than it seemed? Nosfaline was only partially correct. If a percentage had to be assigned to it, it was barely 20% or so. While this was impacting Silas, it wasn't enough for him to still be unconscious. The real reason he was like this was because his mental stats were too damn high. Silas had mental stats at over 2 million. His charisma would likewise be there if it hadn't been tied to his will. Yet, that didn't matter either, because when he activated madness, his will and charisma skyrocketed as well, increasing by a factor of 100. For Silas to be completely drained, he was essentially churning through a vaster reserve than even most D tiers had. And because he was unconscious now, he wasn't in a state of meditation. Maddened enlightenment was only working passively rather than actively, slowing its effects considerably. This would have been bad enough on its own, but before he passed out, he forcefully summoned Nosfaline. This was something Silas usually took for granted, but his hibernation realm was a separate space, one that was formed around his own will as a Vipermancer, a world he had to keep sustained and accessible all on his own. Forcing the portal to open when he was dead tired, in the middle of a realm that wasn't technically a real world but an artificial one that was already rebounding against his previous attempts at control, had practically caused Silas' will to fissure in those last moments. If Silas hadn't evolved to infinite will, that one action could have shattered his will completely and killed him. For the time being, Nosfaline would be on her own. Ekir appeared by their side at some unknown time, his expression one of worry. According to the rules of the gathering, outsiders weren't allowed to help combatants, but he wasn't even sure if he could if he was allowed. He was sharp enough to tell that Silas had a problem with his will right now, but not sharp enough to understand exactly what the problem was. He had no choice but to slowly look toward Nosfaline. "Can you do it?" he asked. Nosfaline was still looking at Silas with that very same worried expression. "I won't fall before he wakes up." She had only just spoken when Elbrum's voice echoed once more. Chapter 1596 Small Fee. The bottom 58 ranks have been decided on. I bet that those of you above them believe that you have earned a right to be treated much better than they have. I'm sure that there are quite a few in the bottom that are enraged with what's happening, but they don't dare to speak out. How about this? Elbrum continued, a sneer on his expression. I will give you all a chance. Those ranked from the 042 Sanctum to the 100 Sanctum, you may pick your strongest champion. You believe I've been unfair, fine. Choose whoever you would like and bring them forward. The Sanctums were confused for a moment. What happened to proving yourself to have the right to prove yourself? However, they wouldn't look down on an opportunity like this one. Each one of them had a genius in mind, and some had a hard time choosing between 2 or 3 of them. When Elbrum saw the latter group, his sneer only deepened. Their existence only meant that they had no chance. If these weaker Sanctums didn't even have a decisive head of them, it meant that they stood no chance. What were the odds of a weaker Sanctum producing several unicorns? Those odds were nearly zero. So, if they didn't have a decisive king of the F-tiers, it meant that the average strength of their best was already close to what Elbrum expected of them. To his side, the Emperor Dove and Emperor Lizard couldn't help but look at Elbrum oddly. This was an odd departure from the original plan. The Emperor Dove looked toward Scylla's unconscious form and suddenly understood something. Was he trying to save face for what happened earlier, subtly telling people that Scylla didn't have to overextend himself nearly so far because he would have had another chance anyway? A chuckle couldn't help but come from the Emperor Dove's lips. Scorpions were, indeed, vindictive. Most wouldn't even pick up on it because they didn't know Elbrum like he did. He was exactly so petty. Yet, his methods were so subtle and clever that people would find themselves disdaining Scylla without even understanding that they were being manipulated. Of course, this was just taking advantage of the weak and foolish. Only people who had particularly low opinions of themselves would spend time disdaining something so much stronger than him. But Elbrum obviously knew this as well. Don't waste my time. You have 3 more seconds to decide. The words lit a fire under the indecisive sanctums. Good, Elbrum smiled. Now, the process will begin again. From the pool of the 031 sanctum to the 040 sanctum, 1 random fighter will be selected. If any one of you can defeat a random selection from them, you will replace their sanctum in the rankings. Of course, I am willing to give you all a chance to back out. However, this will be the last opportunity. So long as you step forward, I will not allow you to retreat again. A fire lit in the eyes of the bottom 60 sanctums. How could they retreat now? It was the chance of a lifetime. Just one lucky chance, that was all they needed. That fire was quickly extinguished. It was a result that bordered on tragic. Elbrum was true to his words. He didn't stack the deck or hide his hand while he threw rocks. He truly picked a random disciple from the pool of 10 sanctums. Yet, the battles were completely one-sided. The longest one lasted 3 exchanges and ended with a head being blown to smithereens so cleanly that there wasn't even a fine mist left behind. Tragic was right. As they died, the contrast between themselves and Scylla only became all the more obvious. As the only person who could have survived this sort of carnage, the only existence strong enough to put up a fight against those stronger sanctums, he was in a coma of his own creation. A youth of the 079 sanctum unlucky enough to end up ranked as the 100 sanctum ran for his life the moment the battle began. Death wasn't the only way to escape this sort of fate, just being pushed out of bounds was enough, but the gap between them and the youths of a top 40 sanctum was so large that not a single one of them had even had a chance. Where are you running to? A chuckle came from a whale warlord of the 033 sanctum. He was huge, his skin looking like blue leather as the gills on his triple chin flapped with his speech. His chuckle had a deep, rumbling echo to it, and it could be said that this youth of the 079 sanctum was truly unlucky. The choices were truly random, but Boran was the absolute strongest F-tier of the 033 sanctum, sitting atop the whale lineage with a meaty, iron fist that was more than likely holding onto a juicy beast leg of some sort. He hadn't expected to be randomly selected, but since he had made the effort to come out here, how was he going to let his prey go so easily? The air thickened to the cadence of his voice until the running youth found himself falling through a quagmire of air. It felt like he was pushing as hard as he could, but the ground was slipping out beneath him. No amount of force allowed him to move forward. And then came the shadow looming over him. His heart sank to rock bottom, and that was the last emotion he felt before a palm slapped him to a meat patty. Boran turned his nose up into the air as though his appetite had been ruined. "Hey, little beauty," he called out to Nosfaline though he was unable to see her. However, it was obvious enough to everyone who he was talking to. "Don't you find it silly your master is unconscious now, leaving a little woman like you to handle everything? You know, I can protect you. Just for a small little fee." His laughter shook the air. Chapter 1597 All of you. Nosfaline didn't say a word toward the taunting. Most of her worries were still aimed toward Scylla's, but since he wasn't showing any signs of waking up anytime soon, she was just going to have to take on the burden herself. With this concluded, we'll move on to the next round then. I hope everyone is satisfied with the results. Elbrum's voice echoed over the gloomy atmosphere hanging around the bottom 60 sanctums. There was little they could say in reply, though. Many had tried to get out of the situation in the end, but just like Elbram had said, he only gave them a single chance. The higher you got in the rankings, the larger the gap between sanctums became, and such a thing had never been as obvious before as it was right this moment. Good, Elbram said with a sneer. If nothing else, he had to thank Silas for this opportunity. Originally, he was just being lazy, but now there wasn't anyone who could find fault with him. As overseers, they were given a great amount of unilateral power. So long as they were careful with the faces of the top 3 sanctums, they could pretty much do whatever they wanted with the others. Knowing that, Elbram was very comfortable with the result. Unfortunately, his own superiors would care a lot more about the results for the top 40 since this was the range where the real rewards started to be handed out, so he would have to be a lot more cautious with his approach. That much was fine, though. He had already saved a considerable amount of time. Congratulations, 073 and 064 Sanctum. You've managed to reach the next round where the real games begin. The skies shook, and Elbram's posture was projected for all to see. As you all know, the rules change every year, but the requirements are always much the same. We are testing for improvement, for overall performance and strength, but also skill. During the last gathering, every sanctum was given a city to manage, and victory was decided in order of which cities progressed the most and how long they lasted beneath the rampage of beast tides and the attacks of fellow sanctums. This was a good way to test the all-around attributes of the sanctums, not only measuring your personal strength, but also your skill in rune mastery and things of the like. Your ability to manage the territories of the Emperor Sanctums is very important to us, and this year, little is different. Elbram paused, letting his words hang in the air for a small time. This time, you will not start with a city. You won't even be guaranteed to have one. You will be sent into a simulation of the demon world where you must survive much like our ancestors had to. There will be no system to help or guide you. The only objective is to survive. Every day, there will be a demon army of increasing strength that sweeps through the territory. In addition, during the same time frame, the territory you are allowed to occupy will likewise shrink. During this battle, external items will not be allowed. Elixirs, treasures, templates, and anything of the like will be stripped from you. You will only have your own abilities and what you can personally create on the spot. If you can figure out how to create a city stele of your own, more power to you, Elbram said with a chuckle. Each sanctum will be given a vague border territory. There will be some overlap, and this overlap will only increase as the overall territory shrinks. During the demon army wave, you will be tasked with defeating all of the demons in your territory. Failure to do so will eliminate your sanctum from proceeding to the next round. Though, I would say it is in your best interest to try and kill as many of them as you can. Elbram's words seemed to have an underlying meaning, but he didn't elaborate. Good luck. Elbram clapped, and all of the F-tiers from the remaining unranked sanctums felt something grip onto them. 002 territory. A young woman appeared in the midst of a sea of youths. As one of the highest-ranked sanctums, the F-tiers participating were all teens. In truth, they had much younger F-tiers that could participate, whose stats would put any F-tier beneath the 5th sanctum to shame. But they didn't want to send them into the battlefield, so they only sent the relatively older ones. It could even be said that because of this, the talent of the F-tiers of the top 3 sanctums wasn't actually representative of their best at all. If using a normal distribution, these talents here were at about the 60th percentile, maybe 70th, in terms of the sanctum's talents as a whole. With the exception of the young woman. This young woman was quite familiar, she had been the F-tier teasing Robereda earlier. Her stature was just as small as one remembered, and her aura remained just as odd. It was almost difficult to pinpoint her true age. However, as the other members of the 002 sanctum looked to her for orders, she was a bit lost in thought. I wonder why. After a while, the young woman shrugged. Since Robereda had asked something of her, she might as well follow through. How hard could it be to kill a summon? Nosphaline's eyes cleared with her still sitting cross-legged on the ground. The region around them was quite dry and barren, the skies painted in blacks and violets, while the trees looked like they were works lifted from an eldritch horror. Of course, her lap still held the sleeping Silas. It seemed Elbram had no intention of leaving him be. Much like every F-tier of the 002 sanctum looked toward a particularly young woman, so too did every F-tier of the 073 Sanctum look toward Nosfaline. Nosfaline took a breath and exhaled. This wasn't going to work. All of you forfeit. Chapter 1598 Water. It didn't take a genius to figure out that the waves of demons would be set at a particularly high difficulty. The youths of the 073 Sanctum wouldn't even survive the first wave, and their skills, whatever they might be, would be useless. Nosfaline was sure that some of them might have some niche abilities she could make use of, but there were tens of thousands of them and she didn't have the time to vet them one by one. There wasn't enough time. She would just end up wasting her time defending them all. Her top priority was Scylla's safety. They would just die because she would rather that than overextending herself and putting Scylla's in danger. Plus, Scylla's was the linchpin to all of this. If Scylla's died, Nosfaline, who wasn't a real member of the Sanctum to begin with, couldn't continue on her own in the first place. The disciples looked toward one another. The massacre of the geniuses of the bottom 60 was still fresh in their minds. Every one of them had died pitifully. They weren't fools. Since this was a task for the top 40 Sanctums, the difficulty would reflect that. A disciple picked at random from any one of the 031 to 040 Sanctums was capable of killing the best disciples in the bottom 60 with a single stroke. How much larger was the gap in the top 30? Nosfaline's words made sense. Maybe I can help. Nosfaline looked up to see Scarvel. From the start, Scarvel was meant to be the trump card of the 073 Sanctum. Before Scylla's, he was the cream of the crop and had purposely stayed in the F-tier for a very long time to refine his foundation. Nosfaline's expression didn't change as she looked at this youth. Leave, or I kill you now. Scarvel's pupils constricted into pinholes. He was taken aback by the aggressiveness, but there was little denying the note of threat in Nosfaline's voice. She would definitely do it. One after another, the members of the 073 Sanctum began to give up. Soon, the only one left was Scarvel. The latter seemed to be hesitating about something, and then he eventually sighed. Decades of planning just to end like this. How depressing. Soon, he too vanished, leaving Nosfaline alone with Scylla's lying in silence on her lap. With a motion of her telekinesis, Nosfaline picked Scylla's body up and began to walk. Her destination. Water. That was where she was most comfortable anyway. Scarvel appeared in the region of the 073 Sanctum, his eyes gloomy and his lips pressed into a fine line. He looked toward his grandfather, whose expression was a bit hard to read but was about as ugly as the warlord would usually show to the outside world. It was clear neither of the two of them were happy. Unfortunately, what they didn't know was that even if Scylla's had been awake, the result would have been the same. Scylla's didn't know why the tiger lineage would both be traitor and waste a talent like Scarvel on the F-tier, but since he couldn't figure it out, he had no plans on taking risks on it. Clearly, Nosfaline knew enough about the situation to react the same way. Who knew when Scarvel might try to backstab them? The problem with that line of thought was that neither Scylla's nor Nosfaline knew exactly what Scarvel would get out of such an action. What would be the purpose of backstabbing him now? There didn't seem to be anything to gain from it. But it was far better to be safe than sorry. We will leave this matter to her, then. There is no better option, the 713th Whale Warlord said softly. No one replied, but they knew that she was right. Elbram couldn't help but chuckle from his perch. Interesting, indeed, but also quite predictable. Now this would certainly make things more interesting. You're cruel. How are you going to treat a beauty like this? The Emperor Dove pouted. If she knows what's good for her, she'll give up when the time comes. She was fatigued battling those scrubs. What will she do when she has to face the same number with much better stats? Even if she's individually as strong as that type the 001 Sanctum threw in, the numbers disadvantage is too much of a problem. Having absolute strength isn't even enough if the numbers are big enough. The Emperor Dove's pout only deepened. I'm definitely saving her. Maybe she'll give me a kiss. Elbram ignored him. This guy had beauties lined up for miles around his home. The universe was huge. The number of beauties was a dime a dozen. The real question was if they had pedigree and strength. Nosfaline hadn't proven either yet, at least not to the standard of the Emperor Sanctum. It was true that the more perfect one's genes, the more beautiful they tended to be. But that alone wasn't enough of a gauge. He had no interest in protecting Nosfaline purely for her beauty, especially not when she had another man's head in her lap. Nosfaline didn't know the thoughts of those in the outside world, nor did she care. Her thoughts were singularly focused. Hold on for as long as she could and protect Silas while doing so. If she had to reveal her true capabilities to do so, then that would just have to be what she did. Winning was important to Silas, so it was important to her. It didn't take Nosfaline long to find a body of water. She had sensed it from afar as though it was calling out to her spirit. However, as one might expect, the waters in the demon world, even by simulation, weren't exactly what she was used to. The waves roared in shadows of black and silver, a thick aura hanging over top. It felt particularly frigid and cold. Nosfaline slowly approached it, Silas hovering to her side. She pressed a palm down and thought for a moment. Then, she nodded to herself and took a step forward. Chapter 1599 Water Manifestation. The water wrapped around Nosfaline's delicate steps, every move feeling as though she was walking on air. With the way it shifted beneath her feet, it might as well have been exactly like that. Almost as though she was riding a moving sidewalk, every light step took her farther than her stride should have. By the time she got to the center of the lake, she was so in tune with the differences between the water she was used to and this lake that there was easily thousands of times the volume of water moving in relation to her will. There had once been a moment long ago when Silas pondered the limits of telekinesis. He could move things and separate his mind, but what exactly was one thing? When he tried to control water with his telekinesis, he would have to form a protective casing around it. In that case, he wasn't actually controlling the water, but instead containing the water and moving it that way. Since then, Silas' comprehension of such things had changed, but it had never become a core necessity of his telekinesis. But that didn't need to be the case for those around him as well. Will manifestation. What exactly was it? To the scorned raps, it had a very specific meaning. But did it have one outside of scorned raps as well? Nosfaline sat on her heels, bringing her knees right up to her chest as though a little girl playing with a puddle trapped in an asphalt divot. Yet this little girl was causing waves with every swaying motion of her hand. Not much happened right before her small ripples that slowly ebbed into nothing at all. It was a fascinating sight to behold. Despite her fingers moving through the water, it didn't react in the slightest, almost as though her hand had become illusory. But it was very much real, and so was the water. Far away from Nosfaline, however, the world was slowly being overwhelmed. Land began to erode, trees collapsed, and as the first waves of demons began to appear, they didn't have a chance to respond before they were crushed beneath millions of kilograms of weight. It could be said that of all the F tiers in existence, there were very few amongst B+, A, and S grade races capable of moving as much weight as Silas could with his telekinesis. Among this number, Nosfaline did not, in fact, have a place. And yet, as the momentum of her fingers gliding through the water increased, it felt as though she was moving weight far exceeding even Silas' own limit. In the hibernation realm, Nosfaline had little to do outside of experience and watch Silas. The world itself was growing larger with every one of Silas' breakthroughs, even beginning to form its own ecosystem of plants and landscapes, especially with Silas planting the space-time seedling within it, but ultimately Nosfaline's main pastime was training and growing stronger. With the effects of the hibernation realm making her recovery especially exaggerated, she could push herself really far and never truly experience the feeling of fatigue. When Elbram said that Nosfaline had grown tired after fighting what he called a sea of ants, he wasn't wrong. But that wasn't necessarily because Nosfaline's stamina was lacking. She just had no idea how to conserve her energy anymore. When she was in the hibernation realm, her recovery was boosted by millions of percentage points. Outside the hibernation realm, Silas could easily deploy the hibernation halo, which, although weaker, was still far more substantial than anything an elixir or similar recovery art was capable of. However, she knew that if she was going to last as long as she needed to with Silas unconscious, she was going to have to learn to do exactly that. And there was no better element than water. Nosfaline closed her eyes. She could feel every molecule, feel every current, experience every bit of flow. She knew how water molecules shattered a slight attraction between one another. She knew how to take advantage of hot and cold currents to elicit stronger tides and waves. She knew how to trigger water's desire to flow and fill in gaps to take advantage of its greatest force. Why was she capable of controlling even more weight than Silas? It was because she wasn't controlling more weight at all. It was nothing more than an illusion. The amount of water she was controlling was a mere fraction of the amount wreaking destruction across the lands right now, so little that Nosfaline hardly felt any impact at all. The downside to this method was that it was hard to react to new and sudden threats. The upside, however, was the fact she was certain she could keep this on indefinitely. She never personally saw a single demon, but they were wiped out nonetheless so easily and swiftly that aside from the first few ranked sanctums, she ranked among the absolute fastest. Nosfaline looked up into the skies to find that a board of named sanctums had appeared. It seemed that everyone had survived the first wave. She wondered if that would continue. She turned her head worriedly toward a flashing red barrier that appeared a long distance away. It slowly shrank toward her before coming to a stop. It seems that I'm a bit unlucky. If the shrinkage continued at this rate, by the 7th wave she wouldn't be in range to use this vast lake anymore. She would have to move. Worse yet, since this lake was so close to the border, it meant that by the 3rd wave, this territory and whoever was on the other side would overlap. Meaning, if she wanted to continue using this method until the end of the 7th wave, she was going to have to defeat whoever was on the other side first. And that, whoever, wouldn't just be one person, it would be an entire sanctum of F tiers. Given their random placement, it could very well be the 001 sanctum. What would she do then? Chapter 1600 Luca. 064 Sanctum. The scent of blood hung in the air, bat wings filling the skies as one demon after another was completely devoured. A youth sat on a rock, ripping meat off the bicep of a black demon arm as though it were well-cooked chicken. Blood colored in hues of violet and bubbling with heat drizzled down his chin, but he looked ahead as though it didn't bother him in the slightest. A secondary eyelid snapped closed then opened again, smoothing out the dryness of his amber eyes. He didn't seem to have any whites at all, his pupils bouncing rapidly between constricted and wide as though he was scanning objects both close and far away. He spat to the side, a subtle wrinkle on his forehead wiggling about before sealing completely as though it had never been there at all. We'll have to show more of our strength soon, Luca, otherwise we'll lose too much. A man of similar looks and relatively similar aura appeared by the young man's side. Before he could reply, though, a young woman with skin almost a sickly shade of white appeared, drawing a long white tongue along Luca's chin, happily wiping away the blood he seemed to be wasting. Luca didn't react to this at all, as though he didn't feel her presence. That ant Biomad is the one who caused all of this. It makes my skin crawl when people look down on me, Lucas said coldly, his voice sounding akin to metal grinding against metal. He'll be dealt with soon enough by the family. But he has managed to do us a service finding Israel's killers. Luca didn't reply. The doubt was clear in his eyes. It was obvious he didn't believe that the Osarans were responsible for things. It was too convenient. What brother really wants us to do is find the one who killed his fiancée, though, the girl said with a giggle. I think he really liked that big chest of hers. She was about to say more before she was cut off by a look from Luca. Keep your words to yourself. There are prying ears everywhere here. If word makes it back to first brother and he decides to take your head, even mother and father won't say anything about it. The girl pouted. Princes and princess, we've found them. All three of the gazes sharpened at once. It seemed they'd found the tail of the Osarans. It was time to wipe 'em out, in that case. However, we've been found. Luca's steps paused. What do you mean by this? Are you incompetent? The scout hurriedly stumbled over his words to explain. Apologies, young prince, but the Osarans seem to have the support of the Sona. Luca's pupils constricted into pinholes. The Sona. The Kyeltha were ranked near the bottom of the mortal Thriskai, but it could be said that they were generally about as powerful as the bottom four. It was the top three of them that had the best chance of claiming the demi-godhood slot, though. The Pervan, the Sona, and the Buri. The Osarans would have been annoying and difficult enough to deal with, especially with their Bloom Rothgene talent. But the Sona were on a completely different level. In name, they were only a B+ race. In action, they might as well have been a true A-grade race. I don't fear the Sona. The girl grinned. If we take out a few of their own while they're unsuspecting. The other young Thriskai poked a finger at the side of his sister's head. They're not unsuspecting. Don't you listen. The girl pouted again and then fell into silence. They are trying to revolve, Luca suddenly said. His siblings narrowed their eyes, not understanding his line of logic, but he didn't have the time or care to explain. Israel had been the firstborn of this generation. Luca was the second-born, so he didn't receive nearly as much attention. However, he felt that he was far smarter than his elder brother. And not only was he far smarter, he wouldn't be suppressed by the galaxy like Israel had been. "Are we going to attack, Luca?" "No." Luca turned to look in a certain direction. "This is not a battle we can win. If the Sona thought to appear here, it means that they have a plan beyond this scope. They probably want to help the Osarans elevate their rank to receive something specific. This is their only chance to do so before the battle for demigod is settled, so they will not accept the possibility of failure. Even if they don't send their very best, it will be close. Then what do we do? Cruise? No, we just direct their ire elsewhere. I have my suspicions about whether the Osarans are really to blame. Isn't it more likely that they are, since the Sona are involved?" his sister asked with a frown. Luca shook his head. On the surface, this seemed to make sense, but what his family didn't seem to have enough of a grasp on was the simple truth that the Sona didn't care nearly enough about them to do this. While there was an argument to be made that had Israel succeeded, having a galaxy progenitor on their side might have turned the tides, the Sona had no way of finding out and acting on it as quickly as they did. In that case, the one responsible was almost certainly someone of the 073 Sanctum, or why else would they feel the need to frame someone else for the crime? The best lies were rooted in truth. All Luca had to do was trigger something within the Osarans. What was that young man's name again? Silas Grimblade, right. He was far more powerful than he should be, powerful enough that it made Luca very wary. He was also apparently a Primus Imperium, according to their Chi Alpha clan's understanding. He wondered whether such a person could give the Sona a real fight. Depending on how the situation went, he just might be able to take advantage. Chapter 1601 Silver Radiance. Once again, the question Luca faced was a matter of how. The Sona knew they were here now because the scout had managed to get himself exposed, and with that, any efforts they made would only lead to suspicion unless it was as perfect as could be. But the more Luca thought, the more his eyes glowed. If they knew they were here, then they would just have to use that to their advantage. As Luca had said, the Sona didn't care the slightest bit for the Chi Alpha, thinking the altar to be beneath them. So, it was going to take a bit of prodding, some smoke and mirror, a hint of anxiety about the potential failure, and then Luca's eyes flashed. That should work nicely. If they were going to stand a chance at becoming a demigod clan, they needed to do things the top three dogs had no desire to and really get down and dirty. Elevating the 064 Sanctum was nice. Making sure that Sona didn't get their way, though, that was easily worth sacrificing the Sanctum. Just one bad result was enough to ruin the whole thing. It seemed it'd be up to him to pen in that result for them. Silas would just have to be the collateral. If he was even awake, that is. Beauty, there's really no need to try so hard. I see the men of your Sanctum all abandoned you. Why don't you just come with me? I've told you already, the fee is very small. Boran stood in the air, his fat folds jiggling with his every laugh. The waves of the water showed no signs of rising high enough to deal with him, while a sea of F-tiers from the 033 Sanctum surrounded Nosfaling from all sides. It was clear that many of them knew they were going to their deaths, but they also didn't have the ability to ignore Boran's orders. The value of taking over another territory was also hard to fathom. With a territory they could step into whenever they wanted, so long as the rest of the Sanctum had either been wiped out or had given in, they would have double the space to deal with the same number of demons. Of course, if Nosfaling didn't die, then they would have double the number of demons to deal with, which was what made Boran's words all the more ridiculous. Nosfaling didn't say a word, though. Her movements were still controlled and methodical, and she made no attempt to snipe Boran out of the skies. Her main priority was still protecting Silas and maintaining her stamina drain to manageable levels. Right now, the fact she was just one person might actually be an advantage. Once the fourth wave of demons began, the 033 Sanctum would face double the number. So would she, but who would the demons attack more? They would obviously target the larger numbers. The 033 Sanctum in their stubbornness to deal with her would quickly find that they were actually shooting themselves in the foot. She had gotten lucky in that the territory near her wasn't one of the top 10. But that didn't mean the 033 Sanctum was easy to deal with either. Their weaker members had stats approaching the 6 figures, and a good more than half of them had stats beyond 6 figures, and that was before factoring in their warlord armors. Despite his bluster, Boren seemed to have noticed the problem as well. Nosfaline looked like she was struggling, but she was in control, and no one seemed to be able to enter a 3-meter range of her without waves slicing them in two. However, he still didn't make a move as though he could feel it coming. Now, his eyes flashed. Nosfaline made a move to control more water, only to find that her attempts lagged a bit. The ape, lion, whale, and serpent lineages had been hanging back all the while, but they all pounced the instant they felt Boren's signal, surging into the front line. If the average 033 Sanctum member had 6-figure stats of just around 100,000 or so, the best of them were 5 to 10% better than even that. And their warlord armors were far superior. No. Nosfaline's jaw clenched. She realized the problem immediately. She had killed so many that the blood had grown denser and denser around her feet. Controlling water was well within her purview, controlling blood was not. There was no way that was natural. A process like that should have been gradual. The only explanation was that Boren had been overseeing things from above, maybe even sending in whale warlords under the currents to keep the blood diluted just enough until its quantity reached a certain threshold. It seemed the boisterous personality was a show to hide his scheming. Nosfaline cursed at herself. Scylla's would have never fallen for something like this. Her eyes flashed with rage as weapons and blades surrounded her from all sides, thrusting and slashing with might that could have toppled entire armies of F-tiers of the bottom 60 Sanctums. From high above, she could even feel Boren coming. It seemed he didn't want to leave anything to chance, lunging forward at the most opportune time. Nosfaline truly couldn't remember the last time she was enraged. Born in an enslavement camp, things like ego and pride weren't emotions and personality traits she was allowed to have. A small kernel of her held on to the hope that she could help her race to rise once more, but even that was faint until Scylla's appeared. How was she ever going to escape when her fate had always been to die in that dungeon? Much of her emotions had been suppressed all her life. She learned to manipulate others, but when had she ever understood her own? But what she understood now was this fury bubbling in her chest. As she watched the blades approach Scylla's, she couldn't even describe what was erupting from within her. How dare they? Flames of Nosfalines were ignited in a silver radiance. Chapter 1602 Just Die. Boom. 9 pillars of water as thick as half a kilometer across erupted. Every enemy within its range was wiped out into such a fine mist there was nothing at all left of their body. One would have thought that Nosfaline had used flames with the heat of a fiery hell rather than water itself. Panels of radiant silver blue descended onto her body, locking into place as long silky strands of ether descended down her body. Her whale warlord armor reached a state of perfection before their eyes in a single instant of time, and her palm struck upward. Bang! Her hand carried such a devastating amount of power and strength that it didn't even meet Boren's. The air pressure radiating from it alone was so great that the so-called whale warlord felt an irresistible pressure when he was still as far as 50 meters away, his downward momentum halting for the briefest of instances before he was blasted back into the skies with such speed that he became nothing more than a faint dot in the blink of an eye. All around Nosfaline, an invisible suction and repulsion force took shape, so powerful that the blades aimed for her and Scylla's all froze in place in the very same instant of time. The ether on their weapons was stripped away as though they had lost the right to use it at all, and their eyes couldn't help but widen in shock. The reaction of those on the outside was far fiercer than maybe even those in the heat of battle. Locked in a life and death struggle all of a sudden, they didn't have the luxury to appreciate what they were truly seeing. But the people on the outside were a completely different matter entirely. For a moment, the 713th warlords of the 073 Sanctum felt somewhat vindicated. When they had first seen Nosfaline's whale warlord armor, they had thought it was absolutely ridiculous. Powerful summons were rare enough. A powerful summon that was also a rune master of this caliber. It was unheard of. By definition, rune masters needed strong wills. Without it, they couldn't impose their intentions onto the world and create and manipulate runes. However, as a summon, your will was by definition suppressed. Whatever your ceiling as a rune master would have been was inevitably weakened while being under the charge of someone else. For Nosphaline's will to be so heavily suppressed, and yet for her to forge a whale warlord armor of this caliber. That armor, the Emperor Lizard's pupils constricted. It was perfect. He didn't dare to say the words out loud, but he knew the truth laid out right in front of him. There wasn't a single flaw. The fact it was a warlord armor and not an emperor armor made it less impressive, but ultimately there were so few in their Emperor Sanctum who formed perfect F-tier emperor armors that it wasn't even worth considering. But amongst their subordinates, was there anyone who had formed a perfect warlord armor? The eyes of all the overseers all sharpened. There were too few. In this batch, there were less than a dozen amongst the tens of millions of participants, and all of them were in the top 10. And this girl was a summon. What a complete waste. Roboreda couldn't help but frown when she saw Nosphaline's warlord armor. This wasn't because of the perfection that was shocking enough, sure, but the main problem was that it wasn't a serpent warlord armor, it was the whale. That didn't make sense at all. Had she been wrong? Nosphaline didn't know of the thoughts of others, nor did she care. Right this moment, she was absolutely furious. Her palms stretched out and she slammed downward. The pressure of her gravitational barrier bore down, crushing the heads of the warlords that had almost reached her and Scylla's. She pulled her palms back, tightening them into fists and forming tidal waves of water that seemed to mimic her actions. The heft of these rivers and waves grew to the point it felt like the world was responding to her fury. Nosphaline punched, and the tidal waves crushed. By this point, wave after wave of demons had begun to appear, but the scene had become little different than one of complete and utter carnage. To Nosphaline's surprise, rather than her stamina draining even faster, with her whale warlord armor on, the cost had plummeted. The armor itself wasn't drawn consciously by her. Her whale gene was perfect, so the world formed it for her. In addition, while it was active, her will was actually much stronger, attuning itself more with the essence of the whale. This made wielding water even easier than before, and the result was 100x more devastating for a fraction of the previous cost. This truth, though, only made her more furious. She was so inexperienced with her own strength, always chasing more power and yet not knowing exactly how to use it. If she was more useful, Scylla would call on her more often, and none of this would ever happen. And now, when Scylla was finally relying on her for something of great importance, these people actually almost got a leg up on her despite the pathetic, pitiful strength. How could she not be furious? Just die. She raised her hands again, separating her fists into a pair of palms that came crashing toward one another. In that moment, the seas parted and then rapidly shut close as though the thick covers of an ancient tome. Boom. To say it sounded akin to a clap of thunder didn't do the devastation justice. The wind pressure alone was so great that the thick dark clouds above, as heavy as mountains, forcefully separated, revealing a glaring violet sun that hung above like the eye of a demon. In that moment, Boran finally began to fall back to the ground, unconscious and his body in complete tatters, plummeting so fast streaks of fire coated his descent. Chapter 1603 Lineal Legend. Nosphaline looked up into the skies, a helm covered her gorgeous features but revealed those eyes as hard as ice and glowing as though a blue star of their own. Bang! She caught Boran by the neck despite his falling speed as though snagging a ball out of the air, the thickness of his neck, even coated in blood, seemingly not bothering her in the slightest. Her eyes burned. There was no one left of the 033 Sanctum. She had killed at least a third of them personally, the rest of them hurriedly giving up directly and leaving the space. For a single person to be capable of such a feat, it could be imagined what the reaction was, but she was far from satisfied. She needed to be smarter. Be strong. Be all-knowing. She had heard these words reverberate through Scylla's mind time and time again, relentlessly and without pause. There was a reason for that. When you lacked strength, you shouldn't lack knowledge. If you had knowledge, you shouldn't lack strength. Scylla had a variable amount of both during his adventures, and he always managed to compensate for one with the other. But she didn't have any experience doing the same, leaving her vulnerable. Under normal circumstances, Scylla would cover for her weaknesses, but right now, he couldn't. It was her turn to take on his burdens. Her gaze flickered as she made a decision. She had felt it in Scylla's heart. He had thought quite clearly that even if her true origins were exposed as a mesmeric's, it was something they would deal with just fine. He was hiding her not because he feared this result, but because he was still laying out chess moves to ensure victory when moving into the E-tier competition. However, it was just as he had said. Who cared if they knew his trump cards? Silken reverie. Nosphaline's eyes were painted in delicate pinks, violets, and blues, as though a fog of illusion was emitting from them, and an enticing fragrance filled the air. Unconscious, Boren couldn't resist even if he wanted to. His mind was enslaved, his will eroded. Petalful mirage. The air froze before a light breeze began to ripple through. It was as though the scene had always been a peaceful one, like all the destruction from the previous battle had already been wiped away like it never happened. Petals of illusion began to fall from the skies, the silky strands of ether extending from Nosphaline's body gliding along the slow air current. And then the first petal touched Boren, then the second, then the third. Boren suddenly began to scream in pain, feeling as though he was losing himself every moment, but there was nothing he could do to change things. It was already over. His body crumbled to ashes. Nosphaline stood there with her eyes closed, her expression calm as streams of wool pulled into her. Silken reverie was designed to enslave minds and erode away a person's will until they became loyal soldiers. But Nosphaline had no desire to do this. Not to mention the fact Boren was far too weak. His still being alive would mean she would have to deal with 2 demon waves at once. The trade-off wasn't worth it. What she wanted was his memories. So, she used Petalful Mirage. At its most basic level, Petalful Mirage triggered memory loss, weakening one's comprehensions and whittling down one's skill mastery. But Nosphaline had long since not been at the weakest levels. With a Vipermancer leading her, was it even possible? Not only was she not at the weakest level, but she had already fully mastered it, and was even beginning to make it somewhat her own. Not only could she wipe memories, but she could take them now. She needed to use Silken Reverie in conjunction so that there wouldn't be any resistance, but once both worked in tandem, there was nothing a target could do to resist her at all. The end result was inevitable. Boren crumbled to ash, and memories about the sanctums, their strongest individuals, their appearances, and whether she should avoid them or not came to mind. But there was something else. Skills to use the Whale Warlord armor. Silas had gotten her the armor, but he didn't have access to the Whale Moon, so he didn't have a sea of resources to supplement the armor and its strength. But Boren certainly did. Nosphaline didn't plan on using her skill for this purpose. She wanted Boren's memories and understanding of the current landscape of enemies. She wasn't Silas. She couldn't adapt as quickly as he could to situations, so she needed to prepare in advance or else she would find herself in a corner she couldn't get out of. However, what she didn't expect was what she actually found. The first thing was a skill, one that she needed more than words could explain. Whale Sync. It was a domain formed with the Whale Warlord armor as a foundation. Using it, she could completely turn attacks into a sea of strength that she could use for herself. Not only could she take energy from the attacks of enemies to fuel her own, but she could also just directly take the energy to replenish her stamina as well. This was the strongest pairing skill the Whale Warlord had. In fact, it wasn't technically a skill at all, it was a growth skill. The truth was that the 073 Sanctum didn't even have this skill because they had never earned it. However, as useful as this growth skill was right now, especially since Nosphaline could steal some of Boren's comprehension as well, there was something else that caught Nosphaline's attention. Her gaze sharpened. The Thriskai, why would Boren have memories about this? Nosphaline dug deeper, and the more she uncovered, the more grave her expression became. After a long while, she made a decision. Slapping her palms together, she triggered another skill in Boren's memories, Swallow Clone. However, she was far from done. At the same time, in the outside world, Roboreda was doing her best not to hyperventilate, her small fists squeezed together so tight her body temp was skyrocketing. Mesmerics, with 2 lineal legendary skills. Chapter 1604. Which one? It took a long while for Roboreda to calm her breathing. A summon capable of such a high level of rune mastery was one matter. It was enough for most here to be drooling even if they felt it was a waste. The fact that Nosphaline would be unlikely to ever reach her full potential because she was a summon and not an independent life would always be something they could only lament. But the fact that Roboreda was right about Nosfaline having a beast lineage was what really excited her. A gold beast. Not only a gold beast, but one with not just one, but two of their lineage's most powerful gene beast forms. It was unheard of. Roboreda was so transfixed by this that she didn't even have the bandwidth to consider how it was Nosfaline had managed to grasp rune mastery in the first place. Even if she had thought of it, she certainly wouldn't have an answer at all. The problem with Nosfaline was that her creation required all sorts of coincidences and experimentation that maybe only someone who was both as intelligent and as ignorant as Silas had been back then would even try. Sometimes, a lack of knowledge allowed you to make decisions that no one would ever make. The idea of turning Eclipsian into a Serpentis through means of using a cancerous gene was probably something only a madman would think of. It was no wonder the women of the professors thought that Silas well and truly fit in well with them. Slowly, Roboreda unclenched her fist. It had been a long while since she had been excited about anything. The world was so very boring. But this interested her a great deal. Nosfaline wasn't entirely sure if she had exposed herself just now, but it was enough to know that she might have. Ultimately, it would have to not matter for the time being. She took a seat in the middle of the churning waters, the floating corpses seemingly having nothing at all to do with her as she reached a state of deeper and deeper focus. Her thoughts revolved around the growth skill she had learned from Boren. Though she had taken on his comprehension of the skill, Boren was still at fragmented mastery. However, he was very close to common. Although growth skills were incredibly difficult to progress, especially an FF+1 like this one, Nosfaline believed that. Chi. Nosfaline's eyes snapped open, a whirlpool of water forming beneath her. The seas churned and the skies shook for a moment before settling down. As expected, not only was the growth skill far more powerful at common mastery, it had a synergistic effect with the Whale Warlord armor. Meaning, because Nosfaline's Whale Warlord armor was perfect, the growth skill scaled along with it. Even if she had left it at fragmented mastery, it would have still been capable of 100x what Boren was capable of, if a conservative estimate were to be given. Now the difference was easily on the scale of 3 orders of magnitude. Nosfaline thought for a moment, laying out her next plans before she stood. A new wave of demons was already rapidly approaching. Each time, the demons had been the same, tar-like demons with skin that looked like melted rubber and eyes that seemed sculpted of wet mud. They didn't seem to have any special abilities outside the fact they were incredibly resistant to attacks and could morph their bodies as well. Of course, this attack resistance didn't come in the form of strong defenses, but instead that they tanked damage very well. Unless one managed to find where they were hiding the core that held their being together, severing limbs or even their heads did no good. They would just slap themselves back together as though remolding clay. Nosfaline's ability to sense these cores was very good because of her attunement with will. Many of her mesmeric's abilities required finding and targeting a person's center of will, so this had never been a problem. As far as she was concerned, with the way the power of these demons was ramping up, she wouldn't have a problem staying here until the 7th wave like she had predicted. However, that would leave her vulnerable to the memories she had found in Boren's mind. In that case, Nosfaline began her onslaught against the demons as she flickered a gaze toward the leaderboards. This was the 4th wave now, and 7 of the participating sanctums were gone already, including the 033 sanctum. It was unlikely that they had fallen to the demons, but they had probably met ends similar to the 033 sanctum. What was especially stand out was the fact the 064 sanctum was still there. Nosfaline's eyes narrowed as a slashing wave killed yet another murky demon. They're coming. I didn't expect the 073 sanctum to only have a single person left. Seems that someone is even more powerful than we thought. The trio of siblings received their report on what happened. Luca seemed quite calm, but inwardly he was wondering if things would still work like this. Should they delay more, hoping that Silas woke up? But even if they did, would Silas be at 100% strength the instant he woke up? Unfortunately, the moment the plan started, there was no going back. He wouldn't be able to tweak the timing without sticking his neck out. Prince, there's a problem. A new messenger appeared. What's wrong? Luca asked, a bad feeling welling up in his heart. But for once, he was overthinking things. There's another sanctum moving toward the location. They seem to be headed right for the 073 Sanctum's territory. Luca frowned. Did the 073 Sanctum have other enemies? This might not be bad. If this Sanctum was strong, then the Sona would have to clash with them as well. This would make things even better. But what he didn't understand was why this new Sanctum was suddenly involved in things. Which one? The 002 Sanctum. Luca's pupils constricted into pinholes, and then a wide grin spread across his face. It seemed the system gods were truly helping him this time. What did the 073 Sanctum do to catch the 002 Sanctum's attention? And what were the Sona going to do when that machine started rolling? It seemed there was no need to delay things at all. In fact, it was a shame things weren't moving even faster. Chapter 1605 Tale. Nosphaline's sharpness quickly became a frown. The auras of these people. It wasn't what she was expecting at all. What was going on? Had she gotten unlucky? Mist hung in the air, the carnage from the previous battles still lingering on the wind. There was an odd oppression pressing down on Nosphaline's chest. She thought she was ready, but somehow the situation had changed on her again. She wasn't exactly sure how she should be taking things. Where were the Thriskai? Were the 002 Sanctum just nearby? How could there be such a coincidence? She was nowhere near the border regions of the other territories right now. The one territory she was near, the 033 Sanctum's territory, had just been dealt with by her. It was very odd that there would be another Sanctum to worry about. Memories flashed through Nosphaline's head one after another after she realized that she had already pegged the auras of these approaching F-tiers as those of the 002 Sanctum. This wasn't a distinction she should have been able to make, so how did she know? That was obviously an answer that came from Boran's memories. However, it was odd that Boran would be so familiar with the 002 Sanctum as well, unless the culture of the 033 Sanctum was far different from the 073 Sanctum, maybe even precisely due to the influence of the Thriskai to begin with. In which case, the Jade race. Soon, Nosphaline had contextualized everything. The number 1 E-tier of the 002 Sanctum was extremely famous, not only for her beauty, but her strength, and her existence as someone who had deduced the Emperor armor on her own. That's all it takes to become famous. Nosphaline couldn't help but frown. Silas had deduced not just one, but several Emperor armors. He had even created his own Emperor-level armor that probably stood above the others, at least at the F-tier. While she had never met this Roboreda, Nosphaline immediately found herself not liking her on grounds of a false reputation. However, that was one matter, and this was another. Nosphaline's head suddenly snapped in a new direction, the ocean's winds and her own senses carrying over a completely new aura to her. This aura was the one she had actually been expecting from the start, one that she was far more familiar with, though it had a few changes here and there. The Thriskai. Her first thought was what anyone else would think. Should she try and pit them against one another? So long as she could hide for long enough, maybe it would work. The Thriskai might be here for her specifically, but the 002 Sanctum shouldn't be. That should cause enough confusion that she could take advantage. No. What Nosphaline was missing, though, was the fact that both parties were, indeed, here to look for her specifically. They weren't interested in any other parties at all. Nosphaline's eyes darted around, realizing that her previous plans weren't going to work. Her gaze landed on the water beneath her. It seemed that this was going to be the only option for now. She began to sink in, however, she hardly had before her expression changed once again. Another group, from a third direction, another set of Thriskai. What was happening? What even Lucra didn't realize was that the Sona weren't the only ones with cards to play in this gathering. The question was, why were so many Thriskai so invested in the outcome of the Emperor Sanctum's warlord factions? And why did they feel like these matters might make or break which of them became the next clan of demigods? Not a single one survived. The young man radiated the aura of a golden bull. The sheer amount of heat in the air could burn one's throat closed, the shimmering horns on his head radiating like a sun of their own. There was something particularly large and all-encompassing about the Thriskai youth. He didn't have the usual reserved frame and well-built proportions of the Thriskai. His shoulders were wide, his stance tall, his feet heavy. Every step made the earth shake, leaving puddles of lava in his wake as though his presence itself was that of the boiling fires of hell. While he didn't have the wings of a demigod, his horns seemed to belie their need. It truly felt like he could establish his own deification whenever he so wanted. Yet, there was one thing that was so very out of place. His face. Immature and a bit rounded, it didn't quite fit the rest of his body. Almost as though the head of a baby had been sewn onto the shoulders and neck of a man. It wasn't that exaggerated, but it was clear the youth was barely a day over 15 or 16 years of age at most, and yet his will was so imposing nonetheless. After receiving confirmation, the fifth prince of the Sona began to laugh uproariously. This was hilarious. Unlike that fool Lucre, he knew well that more than one of the three powerhouse mortal clans of the Thriskai were participating. Not only did the Sona have presence here, the Buri also had presence. And if the two of them were here, the Pervan weren't too far behind. The problem was that the Pervan were led by that monster. Even until now, the fifth prince's first brother had yet to find their tail. But fifth Prince Sona was convinced that it was impossible that the Pervan wouldn't have to expose themselves at least a little before the end of this gathering. However, the Buri had long revealed their heads, let alone their tails. The 033 Sanctum had actually been one of the Buri clan's pawns. But before they could even start their plan and really set things in motion, they had been wiped out in the F tier by a little girl. How could the fifth prince not find this to be absolutely hilarious? The fifth prince had already sniffed out the trap Lucre had tried to lay, but he had come here out of interest anyway. And now there were two things of interest. Why was the 002 Sanctum moving here? Was their territory just nearby? Maybe he should just sit back and watch the show. The fifth prince's grin widened. That wasn't exactly his style, though. With a stomp, he leapt onto the back of a golden scaled steed. Let's go break some skulls. The neigh of the horse sounded akin to a dragon's roar as it reeled back and fell into a shattered crater of its own hooves creation. Chapter 1606 Stomping Bonus. Nosfaline sank into the turbid waters, taking deep breaths to calm her heart. She protected Scylla's body in a vacuum of water at her back, her gaze becoming gloomier and gloomier. The good news, these sanctums hadn't brought their full slate of people. Each of them only had about 100 warriors or so. The bad news, each one of these 100 warriors could have probably done what she did to the 033 Sanctum. She couldn't even begin to read their stats, but she could feel their wills from here. Thanks to Scylla's, she had learned how to gauge strength through this sensory information as well, and it wasn't any good at all. These were people who made even Orthrian feel average, and by that she meant the fact that Orthrian would just be one of their number of follower amongst the group that was led by a handful of elites who could probably take him out after a few exchanges. She had been hoping to pit them against one another, but there was something odd about the fact every one of them was moving toward her with purpose, as though she was their target all along. How did they even know where she was? Nosfaline gritted her teeth. Should she run? Staying here and doing battle seemed to be the most foolish thing she could do at this point. If she ran, maybe she could use the chaos to her advantage. The problem with running, though, is that this fourth wave had just ended, and in a few more hours, the next wave would come. This would put them on day 5 of this event, but that wasn't the important point. The issue was that if she ran and didn't deal with the wave of demons that came, the 073 Sanctum would be disqualified. But, if I move into a new territory with a strong enough Sanctum, I can pawn the effort onto them. So long as they survive the wave, it will be counted as my win. Nosfaline realized that that was what she had to do. With a burst, she shot out of the lake waters and toward the 033 Sanctum's territory. There was just one problem with her plan. There were 3 groups rushing toward her right this moment, and these 3 had her completely surrounded. The region with the most space to maneuver was the 033 Sanctum's territory, but the Thriskai she had already been expecting were likewise coming from there. This wasn't a surprise. They had probably been looking to join up with the 033 Sanctum and would have succeeded had Nosfaline not destroyed them. Now, making it through whatever blockade they would inevitably try to set was going to be the only way that she could survive this. At the very least, it felt like the better option than facing off against the 002 Sanctum directly. The problem. The Buri clan was heading the 018 Sanctum. The irony of Nosfaline thinking of Orthrian just moments before was that he was none other than one of the soldiers amongst this group. And like she had expected, he was likewise simply a lackey. Fifth Prince Buri raised an eyebrow, looking up into the distance. He didn't expect the target to be suddenly rushing toward them. Honestly, he had stayed quite low-key all the while, waiting to burst onto the scene. But he couldn't help but be pissed that one of their important pawns was wiped away just like that. The Buri had been in a good position. They had not one, but two sanctums under their control, unlike the other Thriskai trying to get their hands dirty in this matter. Not only that, but both of them were top 35 sanctums. The little Kyeltha were only in control of the 064 sanctum, while the Sona were in control of the 039 sanctum. And then Nosfaline appeared. Fifth Prince Buri released an almost lazy breath, the air shaking in layered ripples of space. His belly shook, and his slightly blue skin rippled along with it. "I'm hungry." His voice was low and soft, but so deep the already wild ripples increased several times over as though interference waves of pulsing, beating speakers. Orthrian's jaw clenched when he heard this, but he hurried to step forward nonetheless, the scales of his body cracking and bleeding as he charged through the interference patterns. He pulled on his ether as strong as he dared, protecting the plate of food he brought forth. If it could be called food at all. It was more like a layer of blubber and fat, peeled away from the thick belly of a whale beast known as the Infinity Whale. Before the Buri arrived, the Infinity Whale was a sacred animal of his centaur race. But now, their bodies were wasted, their meat left to rot and their bones left exposed in the air, all so that the Buri princes and princesses could stuff their faces with their blubber. Unfortunately, even Orthrian's father couldn't say anything, let alone him. Fifth Prince Buri slurped up the fat and blubber as though he was sipping at soup. It was a sight so disgusting that Orthrian immediately looked away, not understanding how anyone could enjoy such a thing, let alone process so much energy. Fifth Prince Buri released a satisfying sigh, and the interference waves of his voice finally calmed into a gentle ebb. "All right, it seems that it's time to catch a little mouse. I'm too lazy to move. You and you, go cut her off. I'll be there shortly." Orthrian and his cousin were pointed out. Being given such an opportunity to leave this place, Orthrian didn't even hesitate, rushing out in a mad dash toward where he sensed Nosfaline. He had far too much frustration building up in his heart right now. He needed to vent it somewhere. Nosfaline sat on a silver disc formed by the silver morphic sphere, Scylla's head resting in her lap. Her expression focused on the sea of crooked, blackened forest ahead of her as the skies began to churn and thunder. She needed more speed. She needed to make it past these people. Her ears began to thrum with the sound of Orthrian's hooves despite the far-off distance. It felt like they were stomping right on her heart. Chapter 1607 Trident. Nosfaline's frown deepened. She recognized that they were helping the Thriskai. An untimely coincidence. She controlled the disc, cutting across the air. She flew low so that she couldn't be targeted from afar, cutting down every tree they ran into that attempted to slow her down. Despite their best efforts, not only did she not slow, she only accelerated more. Boom! The land in front of Nosfaline exploded, a surging tide of ether ripping into the air and bombarding against her skin. She hurriedly made efforts to protect Scylla's from the impact, the disc's front face kicking up as she used the air resistance and her telekinesis to come to a grinding halt. By the time she recovered, there were two men before her, their lower bodies formed of sturdy black-scaled limbs. They were centaurs in build, their form radiating an oppressive, black hole-like presence that suffocated everything that came into contact with it. Orthrian stood there with his cousin by his side. His trident was in hand, his gaze gloomy as it landed on Nosfaline, and then slowly shifted toward the still unconscious Scylla. Another spike of anger shook his pupils, lines of pressure forming around him as the gravity seemed to double. Orthrian's front hooves kicked into the air, a roar of rage coming from his mouth. His entire body seemed to vibrate, and when his hooves slammed back into the ground, the earth rippled like waves and then tsunamis, growing so high into the air that there was no place to escape even if Nosfaline wanted to fight again. Nosfaline's fists clenched and she made a decision. Burying all the rage she felt toward these people trying to harm Scylla again and again, she wrapped Scylla into a sphere of silver and sent it a long way behind her. With a thought, her whale warlord armor covered her from head to toe. Orthrian sensed the change from behind the tsunami and his pupils constricted. He had never sensed such a powerful whale warlord armor. Not even from the fifth prince. Bang! Nosfaline tore right through, a domain of destruction around her. The gravitational domain that Orthrian had formed was shredded to pieces before her own, his four powerful legs almost buckling beneath the pressure. Bang! It was too fast. Orthrian didn't even have the time to put up his trident to block before Nosfaline's small fist smashed right into his sternum. His black scales warped, the cracks formed by the fifth prince's violent fluctuations only deepened. Autrione. Orthrian's cousin took a strong step forward, thrusting his own trident forward. Nosfaline was like a leaf in the wind. Her eyes almost glazed over, feeling the push and pull of it all and flipping over the attack. Her body spun horizontally to the ground and she stuck out a palm mid-flight, lightly patting the head of the trident. Orthrian's cousin was tilted entirely off balance, his body tipping forward right into an axe kick Nosfaline unleashed with all the vicious momentum she could muster. His skull cracked, gravity and fury working in tandem along with the ether she stripped from his very own attack. The world spun around the man, but before Nosfaline could finish him off, Orthrian had coughed up a mouthful of blood and recovered, stabbing forward himself. Orthrian pulled on his fathomless depths comprehension and pulled back some control from Nosfaline's domain. Using the brief respite, he attacked before Nosfaline could take full advantage and kill his cousin. Nosfaline was caught in the air, her body practically becoming like a target for practice. She could have easily used her telekinesis to pull herself away, but she didn't. Instead, she directed her will towards something entirely different. Now wasn't the time for conserving energy. She had been trying to do so, but she couldn't beat habits out of herself in such a short time, and her processing ability wasn't nearly as fast as Silas's. In that case, there was only one way for her to do things. Brute force and overwhelming power. Petalful mirage. A petal fell on Orthrian mid-attack and he found himself freezing. How did he thrust his trident again? His skill faltered and his thrust mistimed Nosfaline's body. Bang! Nosfaline didn't even look toward Orthrian a single time. She used the momentum of her first axe kick to spin back into the air and unleash a second, even deadlier one. This time, the skull didn't survive. The disgusting sound of bone breaking and flesh being squeezed out of cracks and pores echoed. Nosfaline landed on the ground, her body small in comparison to the behemoths that were this centaur race. Yet, they fell just the same. She tapped a foot and had already closed the distance on Orthrian again. Her gene beast forms had already reached the absolute perfection of progenitor mastery. Although they took a lot of energy to use, when they were used, the results were nothing short of devastating. Orthrian panicked. It felt like the weapon he had been using his entire life had become a foreign object in his hands. He was so flustered he couldn't even process the death of one of his closest family members. He flailed almost like a child with a blade, slashing out toward Nosfaline in a vain attempt to defend himself. And vain it was. Nosfaline sidestepped, grabbing the neck of the trident and ripping it away. A command that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean itself radiated from her, and the trident bent to her will. She pulled and spun it in her palms, taking a strong step forward and thrusting. Gravity followed the piercing arch of her new weapon. It only took her the briefest of instances to decide. She was a trident wielder. Puchi. Orthrian's body was skewered through, his eyes wide in shock. However, the currents of gravity within his body hardly allowed him the time to truly feel the emotion. He was torn to pieces, exploding in a rain of flesh. Nosfaline exhaled a breath, ready to return to Silas's side when a sigh echoed. Oh my, I quite liked his cooking. Chapter 1608 Buri Sky Eye. Nosfaline touched down on the ground, a weapon that should have been comically too large for her resting comfortably in her palm. It looked like she had always been meant to wield it, like there was no problem at all with the fact it alone was over 3 meters long while she was barely a hair over half that size. Steam was practically radiating from her body, silky strands formed of her whale warlord armor dancing in the skies as though ready to be deployed in attack at any given moment. The fifth prince of the Buri clan wasn't alone. He lazily rested on a throne carried by 4, his large belly leading his body. Despite the size of his gut, though, there was something particularly stocky and powerful about him, as though if he focused, he could flex this fat no less easily than anyone else could flex their muscles. Strong. Nosfaline tried to check his stats, but she was rebuffed, likely by a protective treasure. However, she didn't need it to tell that 5th Prince Buri could probably kill Orthrian in a few exchanges if he put his mind to it. And maybe even that was giving him too little credit. Maybe he wouldn't have to put his mind to it at all. However, what worried Nosfaline wasn't the 5th Prince alone. It was the squadron of more than 100 strong who surrounded him, many of whom were looking at the corpses of Orthrian and his cousin with burning eyes laced with rage. If not for the fact they didn't dare to step outside of what they were ordered to do by him, they would have long since attacked. Nosfaline knew of the 5th Prince from Boran's memories. Every clan of the Thriskai was unique in the way they used their sky eye, and each one could almost be considered a separate, individual race of their own. There was certainly a lot of gene theory involved in why they did this, and it was likely thanks to exactly this that the Thriskai were among the most successful races in the entire universe. But that was beside the point right now. What was important was that the Buri clan were all like this Thriskai who stored a great amount of fat on their bodies. However, this fat wasn't for the sake of hand-to-hand combat like many others who took this route. They instead used their sky eyes like a hub of concentrated world energy, almost similar to the world jade in Scylla's possession. With their sky eye as an anchor, they changed their individual cells to store a great amount of energy as well. Because they were still a mortal clan, right now, the only cells they could do this to were their fat cells. But even with all this said, this wasn't just a matter of controlling larger amounts of ether. The energy was just a conduit, a bridge that allowed them to power their sky eye to effect change onto the world around them, extending the range of their sky eye's world onto the spatial plane around them. Essentially, every ripple of power that extended from the Buri clan's members was able to cause vibrational and resonant changes onto the spatial plane around them, resulting in not only devastating levels of spatial control, but incredibly invasive control as well. When Orthrian was suffering cracks in his scales when facing the 5th Prince, this wasn't because the space around him was distorting and shredding into him. It was because the space that made up Orthrian himself, the latter's very imprint on the world itself, was being distorted. It was a subtle difference someone without exceptional spatial affinity wouldn't even be able to see through, but it was also the difference between throwing a grenade at someone and stuffing it into their mouth and making them swallow first. As someone with the Whale Warlord armor, Nosfaline didn't need to be the genius she was to know the level of synergy 5th Prince Buri would have with it. Even if his mastery over the armor was weaker than her own, when paired with his unique gene the results would be hard to turn a nose up at. This was a gap that wouldn't be easily covered. The 5th Prince's head tilted to the side when Nosfaline didn't reply, as though he wasn't used to people ignoring him. His expression didn't exactly seem to be angry, but rather almost like a child trying to decide whether to cry or not based on the reaction of their parents. When Nosfaline still didn't say anything and the 5th Prince confirmed she had no intention of doing so, a smile spread across his face. The slightest bit of a gap in his mouth was formed and the world swirled around him. Gusts of wind kicked up and there seemed to be a black hole in the depths of his mouth itself. Large amounts of ether pulled toward him with a breath. "Kill her," he said simply. The black-scaled centaurs reacted as though they had jet fuel flooding their veins with every enraged pump of their hearts, charging at Nosfaline with the momentum of a true cavalry. Nearer the back, Sterile floated in the skies with her pink wings flapping on her ankles. Her expression was a rare mask of immovability. It was hard to tell what she was thinking, but she didn't act on the 5th Prince's orders either. Boom, boom, boom. Nosfaline clenched her teeth, her grip over the trident tightening as though in a vain attempt to shrink the material. She sent out her senses towards Scylla's encased body in the distance and took a deep breath. Her mind was walking a tightrope of stress. Having spent so much of her life with every action dictated by someone else, it could be said that this was the most freedom she had ever had. She wasn't used to so much weight being on her shoulders. But there was only one way out of this. Kill. Chapter 1609 Naivete. Those on the outside were watching intently as Nosfaline was swiftly being surrounded. One screen after another seemed to all be converging on the same area. Ekir stood in silence, his hands relaxed, and his body seemingly in a state of calm. But his eyes seemed to betray a completely different emotion. He knew that none of this was Scylla's fault, and he wasn't as easily fooled by Elbram as everyone else seemed to be. And even if he did believe Elbram's words, how could Scylla have known that there would be another chance? From where he stood, he had no idea why so many were targeting Nosfaline. Everyone here could see that there was little rhyme or reason to it all. Nosfaline could only feel 3 groups targeting her right now, but there was actually a fourth, the group that triggered the Sonata attack in the first place, the Kyeltha. It felt like a truly impossible situation. Ekir closed his eyes. Seems her situation isn't the best right now. How cruel. The Emperor Dove pouted. That whale warlord armor is really something else, but the tubby bucket of lard seems to have a unique advantage. Thriskai, the Emperor Lizard said coldly. The Emperor Dove chuckled as though he already knew and didn't need it clarified. But it was also a laugh that said he was aware of the underlying matter of it all in a way that those below certainly wouldn't be. Are we going to leave things like this? The Emperor Lizard asked. If the higher-ups wanted us to do something, they would have told us already. Why do you think they sent us? Usually there's at least one A-tier looking in from afar, but they didn't even send that much this time. The implied meaning is obvious, Elbram said coldly. The Dove and Lizard alike both looked toward Elbram, realizing something. Was this the real reason Elbram had been so flippant with the rules this time? It really didn't matter at all. You're so cute, bummy boy. And here I thought you had lost your mind. Elbram looked over with a cold look in his eyes, and the Emperor Dove scurried away again. Roboreda's frown couldn't be hidden from her expression. At this pace, Nosfaline might be dealt with by the Sona and Buri before the 002 Sanctum could even get there. How would she get her for study like that? The world was against her. Nosfaline knew this more intimately than anyone else. And in that moment before she clashed with the black-scaled centaurs, she couldn't help but think of Silas once again. Was this how he felt all the time? How often had he been in a situation like this one? How many times had he faced off against enemies where disadvantage was the name of the game, where his flesh was a signboard for their blades and his blood was the ink they hoped to write their futures in? How many walls had his back felt? Was his heart beating out of his chest like this at those times? Was he worried about failure? Was he teetering on the edge of fury at the unfairness of it all? Nosfaline had always respected the strength of Scylla's shoulders. But it wasn't until this moment that she truly understood the sort of burden he carried everywhere he went. Even in the midst of the danger around her, the destruction rending the ground and sundering the thick clouds above, her eyes couldn't help but soften. I love you, Silas Grimblade. A burning fire of silver erupted in the depths of Nosfaline's gaze. Nosfaline roared, the earth around her sinking down a uniform inch all at once as though compressed by a heavy weight. The instant the centaurs entered range, the front of their stride faltered and their knees smashed into the ground. A pair of radiant wings appeared on Nosfaline's back. Feathers of silver and white radiating delicate pinks, soft blues, and gentle lilacs flapped just a single time. Wings of rhyme. Fast didn't begin to cut it. It was as though she was teleporting. She vanished, appearing amidst her attacks. Her wings bent to the world's rhythm, and all of a sudden even Fifth Prince Buri's control over the space shattered to pieces. The wall of fat coughed up a mouthful of blood, his pupils constricting in shock. The result was being a step late to stop what was happening. Wings of rhyme comprehended the world, nullifying limitations it might impose on one's speed. Air resistance, gravity, spatial anomalies, even terrain. It was all irrelevant. Nosfaline could just as easily phase through the earth as she could take a single step to cross kilometers at a time. This was the strongest movement technique of the mesmerics at progenitor mastery. Heads shattered and blood fell in a rain. In a flash, Nosfaline had appeared before Fifth Prince Buri's palanquin. She stepped a foot onto its very edge and the two slaves holding up the front were plowed into the ground. Her trident swept up currents of space, raising a momentum that felt as heavy as a mountain and as dense as diamond itself. It hardly accelerated much, yet everything around it slowed in relation, the bounds of spacetime warping and showing signs of fraying. The synergy between her whale warlord armor, her wings of rhyme, and her trident abilities layered one on top of another until it became a falling meteor of flaming fury. Boom! In one moment, the Fifth Prince was on his chair, coughing up blood. In the next, he was sent blasting away, his body ripping up the ground, shattering trees to bark and timber, and leaving a valley of destruction in his wake. Fifth Prince Buri coughed up another mouthful of blood, his forearm smoking with his own blood and flesh. He looked down at it, seemingly still in that state of childlike surprise. he couldn't remember the last time he had been injured like this by anyone of the F tier. And then he looked up and slowly rose to his feet, far more agilely than someone of his size should have been capable. The wound on his forearm sizzled and then closed. Slowly, that childlike naivete faded, replaced by a face so deadpan it felt as though the devil himself had drawn it into being. Chapter 1610 Violent Cascade. The fifth prince took a step forward, and the ground shook. Nosfaline didn't let him build up any momentum. Her wings flapped, and she was before him again in an instant. The fifth prince tried to use a domain of space to protect himself, a domain he had always been so proud of, but it was absolutely worthless. Nosfaline was practically the perfect counter to the Buri clan. She could manipulate the reality of even the world itself. How could she possibly care about the reality projected from the sky eye of a mere F-tier? To the fifth prince's credit, he realized the problem instantly and mounted a defense far more substantial than the first time. He crossed his arms over his body, his belly fat rippling. In an instant, his belly shrank and his arms exploded in size. Somehow, they felt perfectly proportional, a great amount of gravitational weight and pull formed around them. Boom! A clash of trident and arms shook the air, and the fifth prince slid back, his heels digging into the ground. But this time, he wasn't sent flying in a torrent of his own blow. His knees bore down as he exhaled a heated breath. He knew another attack was coming swiftly, but this time, he knew exactly what to do. A roar came from his lips, and his whale warlord armor took shape. But at the same time, his body grew an entire meter taller, every ounce of fat on him vanishing into the air, leaving behind a young man with slightly bluish skin and muscles so pronounced and chiseled it looked like he was carved from blue steel. Beneath his whale warlord armor, a plate set of armor that looked formed of whirlpools and churning black holes took shape. The two melded into one, and the power of the whale warlord armor skyrocketed to new heights, dwarfing that of Nosfaline. Nosfaline felt a great pressure descend onto her, and she could feel that the situation might change again. She hadn't killed enough of the army earlier, hoping to deal a death blow to the fifth prince as quickly as possible. Now, however, they were recovering and about to surround her from the back. The four that had been carrying the fifth prince's sedan had managed to get up as well, being far more sturdy than she expected. Yet instead of coming after her, they looked like they had actually received orders to go after Scylla's. Now she was facing off against the fifth prince, who seemed to have brought out a set of armor. It wasn't as powerful as Cassare's, but it was far from weak. From what Nosfaline could tell, without Scylla's expertise on her side and with the fifth prince's protective items still active, it was at least a gold set. At a bare minimum, it added at least 500,000 stat points, more than doubling his current amount. But Nosfaline didn't have such armors to support her. Her strongest weapon now was this gold trident she had stolen from Orthrion. No, that wasn't exactly true. Frostbane armor, bronze treasure. Level, 50. Plus 50,000 constitution. Ability, Frostbane zone. Absorb Frostbane ether to repair armor. Exude area of effect in less than 1,000 greater than meter radius that deals less than 10,000 greater than ice poison damage per second when activated at the cost of 1 durability per minute. Durability, 1,000. This was the one armor Scylla's had given her. Maybe because he felt he would always be with her, it felt like a waste to give her anything else. But now, Nosfaline's gaze sharpened. It didn't make the slightest ounce of difference. Petalful mirage. Whoosh. The sky split as though an angel was descending from above. Beautiful blossoms of pink, blue, and violet descended from the skies, littering the battlefield. In that moment, it felt as though the land of demons had become a haven of the righteous, a heaven for the innocent. Nosfaline stood at the center of it all as the petals fell onto the army that surrounded her. She could sense the others approaching. They were almost here. The 002 Sanctum. The Sona clan. And the third power that tried to hide themselves but could no longer mask their intent from her senses. Silken Reverie. A glowing dress formed around Nosfaline, her trident pulsing with light. In that moment, it didn't look as though it was layered in black scales anymore, but instead like it had been filled with the spirit of a golden dragon. The fifth prince's pupils constricted as his approaching army froze in place, holding onto their heads as though they were trying to force something out and yet weren't able to. Nosfaline didn't look at him, nor did she think about the sheer amount of wisdom and ether she was burning through every second. Her heart pumped with adrenaline, and with a single flap of her wings, she was already before the fifth prince again. Boom! Fist met trident, and the world shook. Nosfaline staggered back once, then twice. Her wings twitched and she vanished, a fist that carried the momentum of a mountain ripping right through the location she had just been in. A trench dug up the ground, three of the fifth prince's own army shattering into a rain of blood as Nosfaline appeared to his side, swinging again. Boom, boom, boom. A violent cascade of exchanges erupted, one giant and a petite winged woman rapidly spinning around each other, searching for angles and erupting with unprecedented power. High in the skies, the leaderboards pulsed as the fifth wave of demons was sent out. But in this territory, there wouldn't just be one wave. There would be 5 of them. Not far away, the Sona clan gained eyes on the battlefield. From another location, so too did the 002 Sanctum. At their helm, a young girl with a familiar innocent gaze sat lazily on a lion, resting her chin against her hand. Slowly, however, her eyes began to gain some life to them as she saw Nosfaline in the distance. The situation didn't seem good. She didn't want the fifth prince to capture her first. Let's go. Her sudden hurry took the dozens who followed her off guard, but they charged ahead nonetheless. The fifth Sona prince laughed into the skies seeing the chaos. He kicked the sides of his golden steed. How fun. His roar shook the clouds themselves as they all charged into the battlefield. Chapter 16:11 The Annale. The look in Ekia's eyes was only growing colder and colder. However, he could only stand there, watching the situation get more and more out of hand. The only slight silver lining by this fifth wave, ironically enough, was that half of the sanctums had already been wiped out. However, that would only put them in the top 21 after all was said and done. To make matters worse, there was a slowly growing elephant in the room. The assumptions that Ekia had made before all of this started were that they would be able to place well while remaining relatively drama-free. But how could that be possible now? Any good placement now would require offending so many powerful sanctums that even if by some miracle Nosfaline could make it, they would be screwed. If the 073 sanctum was personally targeted by the other sanctums, they wouldn't be able to maintain their average of around 70. Ekia's distaste for the Emperor Scorpion lineage was only burning more and more, to the point even the ashes that remained sparked like embers. It wasn't enough that they had taken everything from his master, but even now they were taking more. If not for Elbram, would Silas have been driven into this corner? Nosfaline's trident moved through the air as though commanding the currents, space bending and gravity roaring. She could practically see the tides of reality, her irises reflecting beautiful colors as the blossoms fell faster and faster. Fifth Prince Buri's face hardened when he sensed a wave of heat. He didn't need to look to know that Fifth Prince Sona had appeared. Even if he hadn't felt the heat, that rambunctious laughter would have been more than enough. Xinee boy. You seem to be struggling with the beauty. Do you need me to teach you how to tame a wild mare? As though agreeing, the golden-scaled steed beneath his feet roared, a beam of flames shredding the path forward apart. However, Fifth Prince Sona's expression flickered when the beam crossed into Nosfaline's field of falling blossoms. It felt like some of its character was stripped away, the destruction was a little less, and even his own mare seemed confused. The slight moment of distraction on Fifth Prince Buri's part earned him a trident across the face. His whale warlord armor cracked, and his body was slammed into the ground. He struck out a palm as he fell, waves of concentrated space extending his power. Veil of Effervescence. Boom. It felt like he struck his own head. Sheenie's head was crushed beneath the weight of his own palm. His eyes widened. Just what sort of technique was this? He had never seen a defensive skill so powerful in his life, and defense was his greatest pride. Blood spurted out of his orifices, and he thought he felt his life flash before his eyes when Nosfaline's expression suddenly changed. Her wings flapped a single time, and she streaked across the air in a blinding line of silver faster than even Fifth Prince Sona's mare's beam of fire. She roared out in fury and slammed down with her trident, folds of space bending and breaking beneath the curve of its pallium, landing right atop the head of one of Fifth Prince Buri's sedan drivers. Their body wasn't even split in two. They were left with no body at all, flesh, bone, blood itself vaporized until there was nothing but the air pressure of Nosphaline's strike flattening what army lay beneath. Heavy breath steamed out of Nosphaline's lips. Her grip on her trident tightened. She was surrounded. Hovering in the skies, the sphere of silver morphic bearing Silas was within was protected to her back, the ones who had tried to lay their hands on him being left with nothing at all. 9 gene beast forms, each one having an ability others would drool over. She had only used 4. Yet the drain was proportional to the power. She had eaten through at least 30% of her stamina already, but she had only been in battle with these people for at most half an hour. Now there were more of them, and no end was in sight for this battle. 5th Prince Buri coughed, pulling himself up to his full height. Half his face was deformed, his personal defenses being useless against himself. His defenses were formed with the spatial fluctuations of his own world. How could it work against his own palm? He had almost died to his own strike just now. He had truly never felt so humiliated in his life, and he had never been more enraged. However, just as he was about to make a move, a lion with a mane of fiery pink launched itself through the air, ignoring the etiquette of the battlefield. It ignored the falling blossoms, sizzling heat reflecting the falling, petalful mirage, as it came. It was the same way Sheeny had been resisting them, countering them directly with his will. But the drain in doing so was exceptional. How else could Sheeny have been so easily caught off guard? His mind was fatiguing. The woman riding this lion, though, didn't seem to care. Her only target was Nosphaline herself, and she was the one person who didn't make sense at all. Why in the hell was she here? Both 5th princes recognized the firecracker riding the lion immediately. She was a complete anomaly, part of a race of beings so rare in the universe it was a wonder she would appear in the subordinate force of the Emperor Sanctum at all. The Annulae. They were known for one specific ability, one ability so shocking it was no wonder the universe didn't allow many of them to appear. That ability. To reverse to a previous state of life. Leia was no F tier. Once upon a life, she had been an A tier. Why she would appear here of all places, maybe only a select few knew. Why she would be following the orders of Roboreda was maybe an even more baffling question. In the distance, Sterile, who still hadn't joined the battle, had a flickering change in her eyes. Leia closed in the distance with a lovely smile on her face, her lion coming to a sudden stop before Nosphaline's heaving chest. Hello, mind if I borrow your body for a second? I'm sure you'll be reincarnated into a better life. Chapter 16:12 Unexpected Move. She was so fast Nosphaline could hardly react. In one moment she was outside the range of the battlefield, and in the next she was so close that Nosphaline could feel the breath of her beast blowing against her hair. The aura of a lion warlord descended, powerful and oppressive. It tried to force Nosphaline to her knees. Yet, the momentum of it shattered. Oh, Leia blinked, looking at Nosphaline and then turning her head toward the sphere of silver behind her. Was that you, or was that him? How interesting. Nosphaline didn't reply. There was something that felt particularly unfathomable about Leia, almost as though she had no limits at all. It was like she was standing at the edge of an abyss, staring down into endless depth. She didn't know where it ended, and she could hardly even tell where it started. Boom. 5th Prince Buri appeared in the skies. He directly ignored Leia, striking out with a fist rotating with volatile compressed space. He knew who Leia was, but his temper superseded everything else in this moment. Suffocated by his own fury, he didn't care about anything else any longer. Veil of FFS. Boom. 5th Prince Buri found his fist slamming against an impenetrable wall. Reality rippled as though a mirror of folded space had appeared out of thin air. This time, however, it was the face of Leia's lion that deformed. Caught off guard, it couldn't react before its nose burst on impact, its head being compressed so forcefully its neck snapped. Leia blinked and looked down at her mount. Its pink mane flickered and then dimmed. A mournful howl filled the air as they began to slip out of the air. Still a bit startled, Leia leapt up and watched as her mount crashed down to the ground. 5th Prince Buri roared in fury, unleashing a second attack, and then a third, then a fourth. He didn't believe there was such a perfect defensive method in the world. Bang, 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 bang. When he saw that they weren't being reflected anymore, a bad feeling welled up in his chest, but his fast twitch was too fast. By the time he thought he should retreat, it was too late. They all fused into a single combined attack. Boom! Fifth Prince Buri closed his eyes, thinking that he was finished. He had never seen such a perfect counter to his abilities before, and he hadn't held back a single bit just now. Yet, the attack didn't come for him at all. Leia looked up as a massive fist appeared right before her chest. Her thoughts still seemed to be lagging a bit after the death of her precious mount. She had really liked that pink lion. Her body took the full brunt of the strike, her petite frame flying back so fast the air sparked with flames. As though perfectly timing his interest, Fifth Prince Sona appeared in the air as well, watching as Leia soared. Well, he chuckled, you're screwed. It wasn't clear whether he was speaking to Sheeny or Nosfaline. But what was clear was that Nosfaline's patience had reached the very end of its limits. Her trident was already striking out. Fifth Prince Buri's head deformed even more than before, his body being sent soaring right in the direction of Leia as Nosfaline turned toward the Fifth Prince of the Sona. It was just one after another. Fifth Prince Sona put his hands up and chuckled as though he had been caught in the act. You wouldn't hit a handsome face like mine, would you? The blossoms of petalful mirage began to fall faster. Winds seemed to become petals, currents of pink, blue, and violet moving along the tides in faster and faster streams. Below, the armies began to take the brunt of it, becoming more disoriented, more confused, even as Nosfaline's face became paler. A hint of seriousness flashed in the Fifth Prince's face as he took a strong step back, his aura flaring as his lion warlord armor took shape. Streams of silky ether formed into a brownish gold mane. The pressure he felt lessened considerably, but he could also feel that the drain this armor gave him was at least dozens of times more than before. He could practically wear his armor indefinitely in the past, but now it felt like he was on a ticking timer that might end any time Nosfaline chose to focus more on him. Was this what Fifth Prince Buri had been facing all this time? Who was this monster? If she didn't need to worry about their armies, could they even defeat her working as a duo? Fifth Prince Sona's eyes narrowed. It seemed he had been a bit too arrogant. He knew about Luca's trap, but he came here anyway, thinking it was a joke. Slowly, the Sona clan's Fifth Prince pulled out a twin pair of curved sabers. Retreating also wasn't his style. A wrinkle on his forehead wiggled just the slightest bit, a blinding golden light leaking for a moment before it was sealed shut. The heat in the air multiplied several times over as his nerves tensed to an extreme. His mare seemed to glow brighter beneath him, the pair of them becoming almost like one as they prepared for battle. Nosfaline's wings spread wide, and in that briefest of moments, she seemed truly like a goddess. And then she vanished. Winds as sharp as knives cut against Fifth Prince Sona's face. Boom! In the distance, an aura erupted in a pillar that pierced the skies, waves of demons and sanctum armies alike being blasted to pieces as Leia tore a path out of the ground with Fifth Prince Buri hanging limply in a small palm of hers. However, Nosfaline didn't attack the Sona, nor did she move toward Leia, and she didn't even try to finish off Sheeny. In a move no one expected, just when they thought she would run and abandon Silas, she appeared before a person who hadn't been participating in the battle at all, swinging down her trident from above toward Steril's head. Chapter 16:13 Fleeting Caress. Steril's eyes widened. Even she didn't know why Nosfaline had suddenly decided to do this. She hadn't participated or interfered in the battle at all, not even secretly. All things considered, there was absolutely no reason for her to take this sort of action. In fact, Steril had even been standing outside the range of Nosfaline's field of falling blossoms. Despite this, the flap of Nosfaline's wings pushed her speed to yet another level. At this point, it wasn't just like teleportation, it was teleportation, reality itself folding in on itself to facilitate Nosfaline's movement. Though taken off guard, Steril's reaction was fast. She tapped a foot and slid back, her toes curling in a peculiar way that seemed to only accelerate her faster. Her eyes watched the swing of the trident pass right before her nose. I have. She tried to speak, but then a spike of shocking pain ripped through her chest. Her robes sheared apart, her flesh compressing as her bone nearly shattered on impact. Sinuous grace. Steril's perception of distance was completely distorted, her pupils dilating and pulsing in odd waves. She had been trapped in a twisting illusion that felt so very much like reality. Because it was exactly that. Nosphaline's trident spun in her hands and she took a strong step forward, the trident thrusting out thrice in quick succession. Rolling waves of space and gravity bent onto its body, the earth beneath their feet rippling as though the moon had begun to affect it just as easily as it did the shores of the ocean. Sterile tried to dodge 3 times and failed all 3 times. Bang, bang, bang. Her body curved, blood spurting out of her mouth as she was sent flying back like a meteor. This didn't last for long. Veil of effervescence. She smashed against an invisible boundary, her body reflecting back at Nosphaline just as fast as it had been sent flying. Nosphaline raised her trident high above her head, moving it with such force that its pallium bent in the opposite direction, curling above her head like a pair of god hands had grabbed it from either end, bending it into obedience. She stomped a foot onto the ground, her wings spreading out with such force that harsh winds kicked up and forests for dozens of meters were wiped out in erratically shredded bits and pieces of blackened wood. Sterile's pupils constricted and she realized the situation was bad. The wings on her ankles flared out as she crossed her arms over her chest. However, just as she was about to act bang. Leia appeared between the two, her palm reaching up and catching the length of the trident before it could slash down. The world fell into silence for the briefest of instances before violent winds erupted. The ground beneath the two cratered, but both hung in the air, their telekinesis fighting against the sway of the winds. Leia's smile was gone, her gaze entirely deadpan. It carried a weight to it that could have forced the sun to dim and the moon to crumble. Fleeting caress. Nosphaline shattered her oppressive presence, activating yet another gene-beast form. The spike of pain shook Leia to her core. It felt like lava was pouring through her nerves, blades twisting through her intestines as needles erupted with every beat of her heart. And yet, she didn't want to let go of the trident. As though addicted to the feeling of pain, her eyes flickered between lust and pain, desire and fury. Bang! Nosphaline kicked out with full force, her power erupting like a once slumbering volcano. Leia's senses were completely frozen, her body unable to do anything but focus on the pain and hardship, yet she almost floated closer toward Nosphaline as though to present her head for death. Just as Nosphaline's attack was about to land, though, her eyes snapped back into focus, her Lion Warlord armor erupting to life. Except it was no Warlord armor at all. A radiant gold pulled out of her in waves, her hair dancing in strands of ambrosia as the mane of an emperor lion formed over her head like a helm. Pauldrons of roaring beasts formed over her shoulders, her small stature being wrapped in shingles and illusory plates of radiant steel. She slapped down a palm, and Nosphaline's pupils shook as pain erupted through her. Fractures ran down her shins as her heel was violently slammed back toward the ground. She collapsed into the crater beneath them, nearly falling to a knee. But as she caught herself, trying to rise, Leia was already upon her, striking down with a fist. Boom! Nosphaline's body was pressed into the ground. I really liked that mount. Leia growled. She reached down, picking Nosphaline up by her neck. Launching the latter into the air, she leapt and drove a heel right up Nosphaline's chin, her legs splitting in a perfect line. Nosphaline felt her jaw rattle, her teeth cracking beneath the pressure, her whale warlord armor unable to withstand the might of it all. But she hadn't even soared into the air for long before Leia appeared high above her, smashing down with both fists tightly bound in a hammering motion. Boom! The earth reacted as though the waters of the ocean. First, there was nothing more than a single dot, a hole so deep it was as though Nosphaline had fallen through the world entirely. And then came the aftershock, ripples of blackened soil jetting out in all directions. Leia didn't seem finished, pile driving a heavy stone she grabbed out of the air before it could fly very far. She pierced into the earth, shattering what felt like every bone in Nosphaline's body as she landed on top of the stone. It must have been at least 3 meters across in diameter, and only Nosphaline's head seemed to have survived the damage for no other reason than the fact Leia wasn't satisfied just yet. She had no desire for Nosphaline to die so easily. Chapter 16-14 Mesmer, Nosphaline's vision swam, the line between pain and death blurring to the point it was hard to tell which way was up and which way was toward a light she didn't want to see right now. Her breathing was harsh and heavy, if it could be considered breathing at all. Having a stone crush every part of your body made even taking in air feel as though her bones were attacking her flesh, every shudder and vibration grating out new cuts within the folds of her skin. Leia landed on the ground by her head, punching to the side and shattering the stone. It should have been a relief, but the sheer pressure release sent her blood flying and her body deflating. Shards pierced into her and her body became a bloodied mess, the lines between her limbs and torso blurring. Reaching down, Leia pulled her up by her hair, the fury in her pupils not descending to the rest of her petite features. Somehow, though, this made her only all the fiercer. Sitting on his golden-scaled mare in the distance, Fifth Prince Sona sucked in a cold breath. His gaze shifted toward where Sheeny lay, beaten and seemingly half dead. Somehow that son of a bitch was still breathing. They did say the Buri had quite the amount of life force, but his head was 3/4 of the way ripped from his shoulders. That wasn't just strong life force, it was inhuman. Yet, despite having the opportunity, the fifth prince of the Sona clan didn't seem intent on making any pass at ending such a rival for good. He knew better, for now. The situation on the outside was much the same. No one seemed intent on focusing on any of the other battles. What was there to see? The top 10 sanctums, especially the 001 and 003 sanctums, were rolling through the demon waves as though they were nothing at all. The 002 sanctum was lagging a bit behind without Leia's presence, but they were still faring far better than the 004 and lower-ranked sanctums. Everyone could easily predict how things would go. The gap between the top sanctums was more substantial the closer to the top 3 you got. There would rarely be variables. Without a doubt, the rankings would be the same as they always were. So when everyone saw something as interesting as what was happening to the 073 sanctum, it took up all their attention. Nosphaline's power shocked him again, and again, and again. Every time it seemed like she was cornered, another power would come out of nowhere, even more imposing and shocking than the last. But then it all came to an end. There was an odd silence when Nosphaline finally fell to Leia's hands. They couldn't understand how a summon could wield so much strength, but they couldn't really understand how Silas had managed to get the 073 sanctum into this position in the first place. Even now, no one truly understood the ins and outs of it all. What they did understand, though, was the unwillingness they felt. The members of the 073 sanctum watched in horror, their expressions sunken and their fists clenched. They had already performed more than well enough. However, because Silas was unconscious, he couldn't give up. And because Silas couldn't give up, Nosphaline was stuck in a battle she couldn't win. Ekir closed his eyes, already playing out how this would end. Once Nosphaline was gone, who would protect Silas' body? But then a bright light shook the screen. Nosphaline's breathing was shallow and broken, her limbs hanging limply. Leia held her up by her hair, her expression still the very same deadpan, hiding the fury that was raging within her in her irises themselves. Leia exhaled a breath, muttering to herself that she needed to control her temper better, and then took a step. In a flash, she had already appeared by the sphere of silver that held Silas. She knew well that Silas was the only ticket to Nosphaline escaping. She would need to make sure that both of them were under control if she wanted to make certain that Nosphaline would come with her instead of return to the 073 sanctum. If the latter happened, Roboreda would probably throw a fit. Leia giggled. It was simple enough to handle. In fact, it could probably be done by forcefully terminating the contract between Silas and Nosphaline, then taking the latter for herself. No. The voice was soft, extremely so. If not for her stats, Leia would have probably not heard it at all. She raised an eyebrow and looked toward Nosphaline. And what are you going to do, exactly? Boom. Leia's arm was almost completely torn off, a torrent of ether so concentrated and powerful it connected the earth and the tears in one rotating pillar-shaped vortex of silver and radiant rainbow. Bang! Leia stomped at the air so hard in retreat that the ground dozens of meters below collapsed. She came to a hurried stop hundreds of meters away, looking at her arm with wide eyes. Her Emperor Lion armor was ripped to shreds, the arm beneath barely surviving in bits and pieces. While the limb was mangled, it was already rapidly recovering. But that didn't stop her from being shocked beyond words. Well, damn, Fifth Prince Sona muttered. A flash of wings spreading far and wide ripped the pillar of ether apart, a woman clad in radiant silver scales appearing high above them all. Claws extended from Nosphaline's hands, the very same armor of scales cladding her feet. The trident in her hand seemed to have been morphed into some odd part of her body, still held like a normal weapon in her palms, and yet likewise clad in the very same silver scales. Nosphaline's heart churned with the furious momentum of her gene-beast harmony, her 9 gene-beast forms coming together in a cascade of power and dominance. And then her eyes locked onto Leia. Mesmer Dance, Gold, Gene-Beast Harmony, Progenitor Mastery. Chapter 16-15 Insane Woman. Leia braced for the wind pressure, but it never came. It was as though the wind made way for Nosphaline. A trident wrapped in distorted gravity lines descended, and Leia immediately countered with a fist. Sinuous grace. Boom. Leia's fist missed, the trident slamming against her chest. She cratered to the ground like a falling meteor, but she didn't even have the chance to brace herself or make an attempt to stand. Petalful mirage. Blossoms fell from the skies in a continuous cascade, splitting and multiplying as they danced on air currents. Gilded fog. Dozens of Nosphalines appeared in the air, their wings flapping in unison. In a flashing instant, they surrounded Leia, one swinging a trident to send the latter flying toward yet another clone. Leia suffered a continuous round of savage beatings before she even recovered from her disorientation. Yet even that didn't last long. Fleeting caress. The pain multiplied and pleasure weaved into it. Leia had only just been about to slip out of the bombardment of continuous attacks, only for her to hesitate. Did she want to continue to experience this feeling? Did she want to stay here? Somehow, the feeling to chase after this grueling pain was even more oppressive than before, latching onto her soul and nearly shredding the wool of her Emperor Lion armor to pieces. Leia roared to snap out of it, but not before a pair of Nosphalines appeared right atop her, swinging their tridents with enough force to bend their bodies into whips. In her lifetime, Leia couldn't remember ever suffering such a blow. Blood flew from her mouth, the earth beneath her shattering even before her back slammed into it. Her organs felt like they rearranged themselves, her heart stopping for the briefest of instances before her collapse into the hard ground started it back up again. She gasped out a mist of blood, her eyes opening wide. However, that instant seemed to wake her up entirely. Nosphaline followed up with her attack, but this time the clank of armor resounded. An armor clad her body and boosted her Emperor Lion armor much like Sheenie's had. Leia vanished out of the line of Nosphaline's next strike, the tsunami of earth that formed from it leaving the skies darkened for miles. Huffing out a breath, Leia looked through the fog of soil with darting pupils. Everything felt disorienting, like up was down and down was up. She had a lot of experience despite so many of her memories being sealed, but she was sure that she had never fought something with so much control over reality itself. If Nosphaline wasn't contracted, just how powerful would she be? Bang! Bang! Leia's pupils constricted and her eyes flashed. Her irises rotated in place and she began to see the world not in a normal span of colors, but instead in laws and runes. She didn't think that this gathering of all things would push her to use her race's unique gene, but now there wasn't exactly much of a choice, was there? It was either she did this, or she would be played to death. A trident suddenly appeared by the side of her head and Leia ducked forward, slamming out a palm toward the ground and flipping away. The instant she landed on her feet, she pivoted to meet Nosphaline's attack head-on. The sound of fist and metal clanged across the air, ripples in the wind devastating the surroundings. Leia reached her free hand to her back, pulling out a staff she spun against her palm. One end of it held a perfect circle parallel with the shaft, rings of gold latched into it and jingling about with every movement. I don't know what monstrosity you're supposed to be, but I know you can't keep this on for long. You don't have the size of a beast, so how could you possibly have the reserves of one? Leia's words laced into reality, a will penetrating the depths of Nosphaline's mind as though it would collapse it. The jingle of the golden rings fused into the words and seeped even further into her psyche. Chi. Nosphaline shattered it with a thought. She feinted with her trident and swung out with a kick to Leia's knee instead. Leia turned her shin out in an experienced block, her body moving in a fluid stream of its own. But then Nosphaline hit a completely new gear. Twilight dance. Her clones vanished and her body seemed to fuse into an amalgamation of them all. Every step, swing, attack, every retreat was followed by layers of continuous imprints on reality, as though every iteration was playing out in real time. Leia found herself sweating as she countered and fought back. She retreated again and again, the destruction being left in their wake, rewriting the land as it had always been. Ether exploded and wind currents collapsed, an erratic tale of chaos playing out in real time. But Leia's eyes remained sharp, and she gave no quarter. She could see it already, the steaming heat coming from Nosphaline's every breath, the accelerated beating of her chest through those dense scales, the reddened light radiating out from their crevices. Nosphaline was overheating. She would reach her limit soon. Veil of Effervesce. Leia struck out with her staff, an odd resonance forming in the air. But Nosphaline suddenly used her defensive ace directly against her for the first time. Ringing bells. Shit. Thundered in Leia's head, and she became disoriented for a moment. Her will hurriedly rose to another level and she roared out, but when her vision cleared, she didn't receive the attack she was expecting. Nosphaline had vanished, appearing beside Sterile once more. And once again, Sterile was taken off guard. Why did she keep targeting her? Hey, hey, Fifth Prince Sona called out, standing beside a familiar sphere of silver. Is this really necessary? Nosphaline didn't even reply, her palm slamming right into Sterile's back. As though this had taken all the strength she had left, Nosphaline collapsed to the ground, heaving for breath. Her injuries erupted, blood leaking out from between her scales as bits and pieces of her organs flew from her mouth. See, that wasn't so hard, now was it? We can all play nice. Fifth Prince Sona's words were caught in his throat as Sterile's flight path suddenly accelerated in pace. His pupils constricted and he hurriedly tried to stop it, but he was taken off guard by the sudden change in the sphere of silver. Nosphaline weakly twitched a finger from the ground, barely registering the fact Leia had appeared over her again. Didn't I tell you this would happen? She growled. It was right at that moment the silver morphic bearing swallowed Sterile up whole. The sphere snapped forward and then slammed shut, trembling. What the fuck? Fifth Prince Sona was baffled. It was only now he realized that this was no normal silver at all. Could he even blast through it if he wanted? He tried to scan it and his pupils constricted when he did. He wasn't able to get a reading. Wait, if the durability of this thing was so insane, why was Nosphaline going so crazy to protect it? This woman's insane. Fifth Prince Sona's heart shook as the sphere did once more.